anime autopsy here, and I need you to sit down because we need to have a very uncomfortable conversation about Luffy's fruit and Shanks' so-called heroic gamble. You know the headcanon I'm talking about. The cozy one where Luffy was always meant to be Joy Boy and Shanks nobly bet the entire future of the world on some rubber-brained kid in a nowhere village. That story feels good. It flatters us as fans. It turns every panel of Shanks smiling in fuchsia into this grand intentional foreshadowing of destiny fulfilled. He knew. He planned this. He was waiting for the chosen one. And listen to me. That reading is not just a little off. It actively bulldozes the most interesting, terrifying part of Shanks's character. Here's the thing. Right now, the community is doing this very specific ritual. You grab the Gorosei in Wano, whispering about a fruit that always evades them. You slap it next to Shanks crying over Luffy's first bounty poster. Then you add Who's Who's flashback about Shanks stealing the Gomu Gomu no Mi from a government ship guarded by CP9. 3 screenshots, 1 caption. Oda is a genius. He planned Joy Boy Luffy from day one. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal pattern-seeking monkey behavior. Your brain sees Jesus in toast and goes, destiny. But when you mash those moments into a neat, inevitable prophecy, you erase the timeline. You erase the political stakes. You erase the category of story where an author sets up a mission, then has the character fail it in the worst possible way. Because if you actually line the events up, the picture is way uglier. The world government treats that fruit as a top priority asset. Who's Who gets jailed for losing it. The Gorosei talk about it as something they've been chasing for centuries. Shanks steals that exact fruit. He then wanders into Fuchsia Village and instead of fencing it, eating it, or handing it off, he just keeps it on his ship for over a year, next to the world's most impulsive child. I need you to hear how insane that is. If his job was deliver the most dangerous mythical zone on the planet, why is it sitting in a tavern while he's chugging sake with Makino? Why is the future Joy Boy just unsupervised in the pantry? At minimum, that is catastrophic OPSEC. At maximum, that is the moment an intentional, carefully planned mission goes completely off the rails. And I'm not saying this as a hater. I say this as someone who has spent an embarrassing percentage of my adult life rereading early chapters, SBS columns and timelines, trying to see whether Oda is foreshadowing a chosen one or a screw-up. I am in the trenches with you, red circling panels at 2 a.m. So here's the question that should haunt you for the rest of this video. What if Luffy was never supposed to eat that fruit at all? What if Shanks' real mission was to make absolutely sure that didn't happen, and he failed? So before we start redrawing 30 years of One Piece in crayon, I need you to understand what this video is actually trying to do to your Shanks headcanon. This is not what if Shanks is secretly evil, with a spooky thumbnail and 3 panels. This is a 2-hour-plus reconstruction job. We are going to pick up the entire publication history, the political plotline, the God Valley fallout, and ask, what story was Oda actually writing, and when did it go off script? Because here's the thing. My thesis is very simple and very rude to a lot of existing theories. Shanks' real mission was tied to the world government's most dangerous secret, the NIKA fruit. His job was to control it, gatekeep it, maybe even prevent Joy Boy from ever reappearing. Luffy eating that fruit in Fuchsia was not a beautiful torch passing. It was a catastrophic deviation. It was Shanks slipping on the proverbial banana peel of destiny, except the banana peel is a mythical zoan the Gorosei have been trying to erase for centuries. To make that argument without turning into a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast, we need a framework. So I'm going to sort every Shanks clue into 3 categories: foreshadowing, retrofitting, and a third thing I'll define later that explains why Shanks feels different from everyone else. Foreshadowing is the intentional stuff. Who's who telling us Shanks stole the Gomu Gomu from a CP-9 guarded ship. The Gorosei panicking over a rubber fruit that always evades them. Retrofitting is when Oda goes back and reassigns meaning, the way Shanks crying over Luffy's first bounty suddenly reads very differently once you know that poster confirms the fruit he was supposed to keep away from the world just awakened in some East Blue gremlin. Why am I being this pedantic? Because if we don't define our terms and respect the actual constraints of weekly manga, everything becomes foreshadowing. Every coincidence, every reused pose, every sun motif is treated as a 4D chess move. And when you do that, you flatten the real craft. You stop seeing where Oda was genuinely planning, where he was problem solving on the fly, and where Shanks and Luffy's relationship was forcibly rewritten by the NIKA reveal. So here is the promise. We are not cherry-picking panels. We're going to reconstruct a timeline from God Valley to Wano, Rox's fall, Roger picking up Kid Shanks, Shanks stealing the fruit, Shanks parking in Fuchsia for over a year with a government top priority asset in a random barrel, Shanks walking into Marie-Joie to talk to the Gorosei about a certain pirate. We'll go scene by scene through every Shanks appearance, from losing his arm to that bet on the New Era line, and we'll cross-reference SBS, interviews and data books wherever Oda actually opens his mouth. This is not a sin. This is not me trying to debunk your fun. This is normal, disciplined reading of a long-running story. By the end, you should be able to point at any Shanks moment and say, this was planned, this was retrofit, and this third category is why Shanks's mission around the NIKA fruit is uniquely terrifying. And to get there, we need to start at the beginning. Not with Luffy in a bar, but with a massacre on an island the world pretends never happened. With God Valley hanging over everything, we need to talk about your brain. Specifically, your Oda planned everything from Chapter 1 brain. Because listen to me, that brain is comforting. That brain is warm. That brain tucks you in at night and tells you Oda already knew Luffy was NIKA, Joy Boy, the chosen sun god, and that Shanks was running 4D political ops the moment he walked into Makino's bar. And I get it. I have that brain too. It feels good to imagine an author as this flawless chess grandmaster who never improvises, never changes their mind, never has to go, oh, that's a cool idea. I'll retrofit it onto this random thing I drew 10 years ago. But here's the thing. That version of Oda isn't just unrealistic, it actually makes it harder to see what he's really doing. Because when you assume everything was perfectly planned, you turn your pattern-seeking monkey brain up to 11. You start seeing Jesus in toast. Every old panel becomes foreshadowing. A background gag? Foreshadowing. A throwaway line? Foreshadowing. Shanks staring at the sea for 3 seconds. Clearly a 25-year NIKA setup. And this is not a sin. This is normal. This is how fandoms cope with a story that's older than most of the community. The problem is that without categories, you flatten the entire craft of long-form storytelling into one word. Foreshadowing becomes this magic spell that covers everything. Genuine intentional setups, clever retrofits, pure coincidence, editorial mandates, late discoveries, all shoved into the same bucket. When everything is foreshadowing, nothing is. You actually erase the difference between an author who planned a payoff and an author who was just smart enough to reuse an old toy. So I need you to hold a simple metaphor in your head. Gun versus vase. A gun on the mantle in Act 1 because you already know you're firing it in Act 3. That's intentional. That's classical foreshadowing. You put it there on purpose, with a payoff already in mind. A random vase you threw into the scene because the room looked empty, and 3 drafts later you go, oh, that's the murder weapon now. That's different. Still smart, still cool, but it's not the same category of planning. Now here's where the community short-circuits. Shanks' mission and the NIKA fruit sit right at the intersection of gun and vase. Was the Gomu Gomu no Mi always the gun on the mantle from Chapter 1? Or did Oda later decide that this rubber fruit was secretly HITO HITO no Mi, model NIKA, and then work backwards? Did Shanks walk into Fuchsia as a man guarding a known god weapon? Or did he become that guy only after Who's Who, the Gorosei dialogue, and Gear 5 existed in Oda's head? This is why arguments about Oda 4D chess around Shanks get so ugly. People are unknowingly mixing categories. They're calling vases guns and guns vases, and then wondering why the timeline of Shanks stealing that government fruit, losing it to a random kid, and later walking into Marie-Joie to chat with the Gorosei feels impossible. So in the next section, we're going to stop hand-waving it. I'm going to give you a 3-part model that once you see it, will make half of the Oda planned Joy Boy from day 1 discourse evaporate on contact, and it's going to put Shanks' real mission in a very uncomfortable box. So here's the thing. If we're going to stop hand-waving Shanks' entire deal, we need to stop hand-waving the word foreshadowing first. Our community throws that term around for everything from a deliberate plot gun to a vaguely sun-shaped rock in the background. Those are not the same category of writing, and if you blur them together, Shanks' mission turns into mystical nonsense instead of an author doing craft. Foreshadowing in the strict sense is boringly specific. An author intentionally plants a detail because they already know the payoff they're aiming at. Intentionally is the hinge. You put the gun on the mantle in Chapter 1 because you have already decided someone gets shot in Chapter 50. That's Chekhov. That's not, maybe I'll use this later. That's, this is already scheduled for murder. Laboon and Brook, that's real foreshadowing. Oda has said he planned them as a pair. The whale isn't a coincidence, it's a receipt. Which brings us to the second category. Retrofitting is when an author looks back at existing material and assigns new meaning to it after the fact. You wrote a random masked villain years ago, fans went wild, and now you decide, sure, that was the secret brother all along. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most long series survive. You grab an old toy from the sandbox and rebrand it as a relic. Skypia's mantra, quietly becoming haki, is a textbook example. The power system wasn't fully nailed down, so Oda stitches it together later and makes it feel planned. But listen to me, there's a third thing happening in One Piece that our foreshadowing discourse keeps tripping over. I'm calling it pre-writing. Pre-writing is when an author knows the ending, knows the major mysteries, knows the core reveals before publication, but doesn't lock in every route to get there. Instead of planting individual Chekhov guns, they build flexible scaffolding. Themes, symbols, vague prophecies, ominous fruits, and then later crystallize those into specific plot payoffs. In pre-writing, the hint isn't predicting a future decision. It's a fragment of a decision that already exists in the author's head, just not in final form. The sun motifs, the drums of liberation, the way Luffy's rubber powers are consistently cartoonish and reality-breaking. Those feel less like improv and more like Oda leaving himself Joy Boy-shaped negative space to fill when the time is right. This is fine. This is normal. This is how you survive a 25-year serialization without a 10,000-cell spreadsheet tattooed on your soul. And in a weekly manga, these three modes are constantly bleeding into each other. A pre-written idea gets foreshadowed in one arc, then retrofitted in another. An accidental gag becomes a planned symbol 3 years later. The real skill is making the retrofits and the pre-written scaffolding feel like pure foreshadowing to fans who reread and go, "He planned Joy Boy from page 1, while the author is over there going, "I planned the destination, not every roadside convenience store." Which is where Shanks and the Gomu/NIKA fruit walk in, red hair blazing, and ruin everyone's certainty. Because across different eras of One Piece's publication, that one stolen fruit shows up as all three modes at once. Early just rubber gags, mid-series government panic, late game NIKA lore, Shanks crying over a newspaper, and then casually visiting the Gorosei. That's not one kind of foreshadowing. That's a layered stack of foreshadowing, retrofitting, and pre-writing colliding. So next, I need you to walk through Shanks' timeline with this model in your head. Because once we separate which pieces had to be planned and which pieces could be retrofitted, the idea that Luffy was never supposed to eat that fruit stops being a wild theory and starts looking uncomfortably structural. So before we start assigning 5D chess motives to Shanks, we need to talk about something very unsexy, the reality of weekly manga. Because if you're picturing Oda in 1997 stroking his chin and calmly storyboarding Joy Boy NIKA, Shanks' secret mission, and the exact panel where Luffy smiles in Gear 5, no, absolutely not. Here's the thing. A weekly Jump author is drawing 15 to 20 pages every single week, not when the muse strikes, every week. That's thumbnails, roughs, pencils, inks, backgrounds, screen tones, plus wrangling assistants so your crowd shot doesn't look drawn by a sleep-deprived raccoon. On top of that, you've got editorial meetings, script checks, and the permanent guillotine of cancellation hanging over your neck. You miss a deadline? You don't take a mental health day. You blow up a printing schedule for a magazine that sells in the millions. So when fans in the community talk about a 30-year master outline where every Joy Boy hint was meticulously planned from chapter 1, I need you to understand how insane that sounds from a production standpoint. And it's not just time, it's pressure. Editors are in your ear saying, can we speed this up? Can we stretch this out? Readers are dropping during Skypiea, can we bring in Enel faster? Reader survey rankings literally decide whether your story lives or dies. If an arc underperforms, it gets cut. If a side character polls high, suddenly they're back with a tragic flashback and a power-up. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is how commercial storytelling works. You want an example? Think about how many battle shonen suddenly discover a tragic rival or a secret bloodline halfway through serialization. That is not some sacred pre-written gospel descending from Mount Outline. That is an author, an editor, and a stack of survey cards locked in a tiny room going, okay, what do we do to not get axed in 12 weeks? Now, Oda is a monster planner. I've already argued he pre-wrote the endgame categories: Void Century, Will of D, Ancient Weapons, the broad strokes of Joy Boy. But there is a massive difference between pre-writing big pillars and having a rigid 30-year flowchart you never touch. The schedule will beat that out of you. The magazine will beat that out of you. Reality will beat that out of you harder than Kaido's club. Pattern interrupt. Imagine trying to plan your life to age 60 when you're 15 and then being legally required to follow that plan no matter what happens. That's what some of you are projecting onto Oda. It's absurd. So what actually survives in weekly manga? Flexible scaffolding. You pre-write the destination and a few non-negotiable reveals. Then you retrofit, expand, compress, and reroute constantly to survive the week-to-week grind. This is fine. This is how you get long-running series instead of beautiful, cancelled corpses. Which means, if you accept these constraints, Shanks' mission and the NIKA fruit cannot be a single immutable script from day one. They have to be evolving constructs, pre-written pillars wrapped in years of foreshadowing and retrofitting. And once you read his timeline through that lens, his failure in Fuchsia stops being a gag and starts looking like a structural pivot the story bent itself around. So now we can finally walk through that timeline and ask, point by point, what had to be planned and what was cleverly rebuilt after the fact. So before we start accusing a red-haired emperor of bungling the Joy Boy handoff, we need to do something very un-YouTube and actually define our terms. I need you to slow your brain down for a second, because everything from here on out lives or dies on one word: intent. Foreshadowing, in the strict sense we're using, is not, wow, those two panels look similar. Foreshadowing is when an author intentionally puts a detail in early because they already know the specific payoff it's pointing to. Not a vague vibe, not some twist later, a concrete, planned destination. Here's the thing. If you write chapter 1 where a character refuses to go near the ocean, breaks out in a cold sweat when it rains, and dodges every question about swimming, that's setup. Then in chapter 50, you reveal they watched their sibling drown, and you, the author, had that exact traumatic flashback in your outline from day 1. That's foreshadowing. The fear exists because the backstory already existed in your head. Now, if you wrote the fear in chapter 1 just because, A, water phobia is quirky, and 49 chapters later you go, oh, I can turn that into a drowning trauma, that's neat. That's retrofitting. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most competent serialized storytelling survives contact with deadlines and editors. You discover meaning later and staple it onto old material. Totally valid. Different category. And then there's the boring reality most fans skip. Almost every halfway decent author is doing short to mid-term foreshadowing constantly. This is not rare genius. This is normal. This is storytelling 101. You seed the breakup in chapter 3 so the divorce in chapter 10 doesn't feel random. You mention the mayor's health problems so the assassination cover story lands. If you're not doing that, you're not writing, you're live tweeting. So for this video, we need a clean set of criteria. When we call something foreshadowing, we're asking, how clear was the setup at the time? How close is the payoff to that setup? And crucially, does the payoff rely on information the author demonstrably didn't have yet? If the explanation only appears in a much later SBS, or it depends on a world-building rule that got quietly retconned in, then by default we treat it as a retrofit, not some galaxy brain prophecy. That's why your brain, my brain, our collective pattern-seeking monkey brain that sees Jesus in toast, is not admissible evidence. It fits really well, is not the same as it was planned. We need receipts. And listen to me, this is where it gets uncomfortable, because some of those early Shanks and Luffy moments, they do meet this strict bar. They are real intentional setups. Just not for the Shanks hand-picked joy boy from chapter 1 narrative the community keeps hallucinating. So let's walk through Fuchsia and beyond with those rules in hand and see what actually holds up. So before we march back into Fuchsia with red yarn and conspiracy boards, we need to talk about the elephant in the room, retrofitting. Because if you go into One Piece hunting for only pure stainless steel foreshadowing, you're going to misread half the story and then yell at Oda for problems he does not have. Here's the thing. Retrofitting is not plot hole patching in the lazy sense. Retrofitting is when an author looks at something they wrote years ago, something that maybe only had a vague purpose or no special purpose at all, and then decides, actually, that thing means this now. Then they write new scenes, new dialogue, new context that reach backward and make it feel intentional. The meaning is assigned after the fact, but the craft happens in the present. And listen to me, this is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how most long-running manga, comics and TV shows survive once they blow past their original scope. You start with a 5-year plan. The magazine wants 20. The anime explodes. The merch machine starts printing money, and suddenly your tight outline is a polite suggestion. If you don't retrofit, you either end the story early or you drown. The quality test isn't, was this secretly planned in 1997? The test is, does the retrofit feel organic? Does it respect the emotional truth of the earlier scenes, even if the plot function changes? When Kinemon's dragon gag in Punk Hazard gets recontextualized as Wano trauma, that's a retrofit. But the core emotion, this weirdly proud, deeply anxious samurai dad trying to hold it together, was always there. Oda didn't betray the old material. He deepened it. Fans, though, want the 4D chess version. We want the author to have a corkboard of the entire story from day one, every reveal surgically pre-planned, because that makes our pattern-seeking monkey brains feel smart for spotting Jesus in the toast. Meanwhile, the author needs freedom. They need to be able to pivot, to follow new ideas, to respond to editors and sales without being crucified on Twitter for inconsistencies. Those incentives are not aligned, and the community forgets that every time we meme Oda planned this 25 years ago into the ground. So I need you to put this in a separate category in your head. Foreshadowing is intentional setup for a known payoff. Retrofitting is intentional reinterpretation of old material to serve a new or clarified payoff. Both are deliberate writing. Both are valid storytelling tools. The difference is timing, not morality. And that brings us to the fruit. The reclassification of the Gomu Gomu no Mi into HITO HITO no Mi model, NIKA. That is a textbook retrofit. Early One Piece treats Luffy's rubber body as a goofy power with some clever combat applications. There is no on-page evidence in East Blue that Oda had mythical sun god warrior of liberation fully spec'd out. But when the Gorosei suddenly start panicking about a fruit that always evades them, when Who's Who reveals a government ship guarding this specific fruit, when Shanks cries over that first bounty poster, Oda is reaching back and assigning terrifying new meaning to something we took for granted. And this is normal. This is fine. The question isn't, was NIKA planned from chapter 1? The question is, does this retrofit harmonize with what we already felt about Luffy and his story? Hold that standard, because when we apply it to Shanks's so-called mission, things get very uncomfortable very fast. So before we crack open the Shanks discourse and everyone starts throwing chairs, I need you to step into a safer sandbox with me. We're going to Naruto. We're going to Toby. Because once you see how this works there, you're going to have a much harder time screaming plot hole when we get back to red-haired Jesus. Quick recap so we're on the same page. Early Shippuden. Toby shows up as this goofy masked Akatsuki tag-along. He's doing slapstick, he's annoying Deidara, he's the comic relief gremlin in a murder cult. Then, over a couple of heel turns, the mask comes off and boom, it's Obito, Kakashi's dead childhood friend. Suddenly the clown is the mastermind, the Moon's Eye plan architect, the emotional core of the war. Now, what does the community do? Same thing we always do. We retroactively convince ourselves it was all meticulously planned foreshadowing. See, the hair silhouette matches Kid Obito's. See, the mask only has one eye hole on the same side. See, he mentioned the Fourth War way back when. We grab every panel where Toby stands vaguely Kakashi-shaped and treat it as courtroom evidence. Except here's the thing. If you apply the strict definition of foreshadowing we talked about earlier, intentional setup for a known payoff, most of those hints are paper thin. A round orange mask with one eye hole is not a blood oath that the author had the Obito twist locked from day one. A similar hairstyle in a black and white weekly manga is not a binding contract. Sometimes a generic spiky haircut is just a generic spiky haircut. And Kishimoto has basically told you this. In interviews, he's admitted Toby's identity was in flux. At various points, Toby was going to be Madara for real, or an empty shell used by Madara or some other Uchiha stand-in. He said he didn't have every detail nailed when Toby first appeared. The war arc and Obito's full backstory crystallized way later under editorial and production pressure. That is not me slandering the man. That is him describing his own writing process. So what do we do with that? Do we declare Naruto ruined? Do we say, the mastermind was not pre-written in 1999, therefore this is bad storytelling? No. Because reclassifying the Toby/Obito reveal as retrofit doesn't kill it. It actually explains why it works. Kishimoto looked at his toolbox and said, I already have Kakashi's trauma. I already have the graveyard of Team Minato. If I weld this goofy side villain onto that existing emotional infrastructure, suddenly the war has a face. That's an emotional retrofit. You take an earlier element that wasn't fully planned, You assign it new weight, and you cash out emotional capital you've been quietly saving in the background. This is not a sin. This is normal. When it harmonizes with what the story already made you feel, your brain doesn't care whether the spreadsheet existed 10 years earlier. So listen to me. If you can accept that Toby was retrofitted into Obito without throwing Naruto in the trash, you have already admitted the principle I'm arguing. You've already said, I care about coherence and impact more than chronology of intent. And once you've said that out loud, we need to walk back to One Piece and ask a much uglier question. Because what happens when the goofy side character who got retrofitted isn't the masked villain, but the smiling red-haired mentor who handed Luffy the hat? What happens when Shanks is the retrofit? So if Shanks can be a retrofit, what do we even do with that? Do we just throw up our hands and say, nothing means anything, Oda is winging it? No. This is where I need you to zoom out, because we're actually missing a third tool in the toolbox. And I'm going to use a fake word. Academics. Avert your eyes. I'm calling it pre-writing. This is not a formal term. You're not going to open some dusty narratology textbook and see Chapter 3, Pre-writing in Weekly Shonen. But it's an incredibly useful label for what Oda appears to be doing, laying down thematic and symbolic scaffolding without locking in the exact final payoff on day one. Here's the thing. With pre-writing, the author isn't scripting every move on a chessboard. They're planting the board, a couple of queens, and a note that says, one of these is getting sacrificed in the end. Big, vague pillars. Inherited will. The dawn of the world. A giant straw hat hidden under Mariejwa. A red-haired pirate who carries Roger's hat and talks about a new era. Those aren't precise foreshadowing clues in the gun on the mantle sense. They're structural beams that can later be attached to specific plot answers once the author decides which route to take. And Oda is a maniac about this. In a good way. Most authors either plan tightly and then improvise around the edges, or they just freestyle and retrofit when needed. Oda aggressively seeds these massive, flexible symbols decades early and gives his future self a toy chest. He doesn't need to know in Chapter 1 exactly how the Will of D connects to NIKA, the Void Century, and the ancient weapons. He just needs the D, the sun motifs, the lost history, and the promise of a dawn all sitting there, humming, waiting for him. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how you survive a 25-year serialization without your brain melting out of your ears. You pre-write the pillars, and then you let the details crystallize when you reach them. And this is where Shanks lives for most of the series. Not as a carefully foreshadowed mastermind with a fully planned dossier in Oda's filing cabinet, but as a pre-written symbol. He's Roger's heir. He's the baton to the next generation. He's the calm red silhouette on the horizon anytime Oda wants to talk about the new era, the balance of power, or the weight of that hat. His concrete mission, his political role, even his relationship to the government gets sharpened slowly, panel by panel, as the story's other pillars solidify. Pattern interrupt. What if the problem isn't that Shanks secretly planned everything, but that Oda didn't? Because once you start mapping his appearances against this framework, the popular headcanon that Shanks intentionally groomed Luffy as Joy Boy starts to wobble. Hard. It starts to look a lot shakier than the far messier, more human possibility. That Shanks was carrying a pre-written symbol, lost control of it in Fuchsia, and then Oda spent the next 20 years tightening the noose around that accident. And to prove that, we need to stop talking in abstractions and walk through Shanks' actual timeline, from God Valley's shadow to that goofy village bar. So, listen to me, because this is where the Shanks fumbled the bag meme stops being a joke and turns into an actual historical problem. We keep treating that barrel on the Red Force as some goofy coincidence, when in Oda's pre-written timeline, it's the endpoint of a chain that starts at one of the most censored events in the story, God Valley. Here's the thing. God Valley is our ground zero. You've got Rox D. Zerbeck assembling a murderer's row of future emperors. You've got celestial dragons and their slaves on a hunting trip. And then you have Roger and Garp teaming up to stop whatever nightmare scenario was about to pop off. The battle is so bad the island doesn't just get destroyed, it gets erased off official maps. The world government doesn't redact God Valley. They pretend it literally never existed. Now we don't have all the details. This is fine. This is normal. Oda is drip-feeding that flashback on purpose. But even with the gaps, he quietly drops one absurd detail. Around this era, Roger's crew finds a baby stuffed in a treasure chest. That baby is Shanks. I need you to sit with that for a second. In a story where treasure chests usually contain poneglyph rubbings, weapons, or devil fruits, the future red-haired emperor is treated as contraband. Fast forward to what we learn much later. The world government has been hunting one specific fruit for centuries. The thing we used to call the Gomu Gomu no Mi. The thing the Gorosei rebrand as HITO HITO no Mi, model NIKA. They say it always evades them. Not occasionally. Not recently. Always. That's not just flavor text. That's Oda telling you there's a long, messy history of failed containment attempts, of ships sunk, of agents punished. Who's Who is literally jailed for losing it once. So when you line up the key beats, a pattern starts to appear, even to a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. God Valley explodes off the map. Somewhere in that shadow, baby Shanks ends up on Roger's ship. Roger sails, reaches Laugh-Tale, learns about Joy Boy and the true history, then walks into his own execution after handing Shanks that straw hat. Time skip forward. Shanks grows into an independent Yonko-level figure who somehow has enough clout to stroll into Marijois and book a meeting with the Gorosei. And in the middle of that rise, we get the Who's Who flashback. Shanks steals the Gomu Gomu from a government ship guarded by CP9. That's not a random grab bag heist. That's a targeted extraction of a classified asset that the highest authority in the world has been obsessively chasing. You don't accidentally steal the one fruit they've been trying to cage since God Valley, which brings us back to that barrel. The moment Shanks' vague, pre-written symbolism, the hat, the scar, the bet on the new era speeches, collides with a very specific, very illegal piece of cargo. The government's problem child fruit is now sitting on a Yonko's deck, one hungry kid away from becoming the biggest disaster of the century. And in the next section, we need to talk about what Shanks actually does in Fuchsia when that disaster walks into the bar, orders a meal, and reaches for destiny in a wine cellar. So when we cut over to Who's Who's flashback, this is Oda basically grabbing you by the collar and going, hey, that gag fruit you've been laughing at for 20 years, pay attention. Who's Who isn't some random marine scrub. He's CP9. He's part of the government's Black Ops assassination unit. And his big failure, the thing that ruins his career and lands him in prison, is losing the Gomu Gomu no Mi on a transport ship to the Red Hair Pirates. Listen to me. You do not assign CP9 to escort a mid-tier paramecia that turns you into rubber unless something has gone catastrophically wrong in the writing room. Either the world government is the worst resource manager in history, or the fruit is not what the in-story marketing brochure says it is. The community treats that scene as background lore, but from a storytelling perspective, it's a siren. It's the author screaming top priority asset, while the characters are still calling it a joke. Here's the thing. Foreshadowing, in the strict sense we've been talking about, would mean Oda knew from day one that this was a mythical Zoan, planned the government's obsession, and planted all of this early. But the Who's Who flashback is much later. This is where we slide out of pure foreshadowing and into that second category, retrofitting. Oda is reaching back, grabbing the already established rubber fruit and retroactively upgrading its importance by showing you the caliber of people assigned to babysit it. And then he doubles down with the punishment. Who's Who isn't demoted. He's not yelled at and told to do push-ups until his abs awaken haki. He is disappeared, imprisoned, tortured. The reaction matches losing a national secret, not dropping a box of clown noses overboard. That level of consequence fits perfectly once you know it's the HITO HITO no Mi model NIKA, tied to Joy Boy and the one existence the government cannot afford to resurface. It does not fit. Oops. The rubber guy fruit got stolen. Guess we'll draft another intern. So what's actually happening here in terms of writing? Oda is retrofitting the fruit's importance backward, while making it feel intentional. He takes Shanks' crew randomly having the Gomu Gomu no Mi in Chapter 1, and recontextualizes it as a move in a secret, pre-written war over NIKA. Suddenly, Shanks isn't a cool pirate who stumbled on a fun power. He's the guy who hit a government convoy guarded by CP9 and walked away with their problem child, which raises the question you're supposed to trip over. If Shanks just wanted a strong ability for himself or his officers, why is no one on his crew eating this thing? Why isn't he fencing it on the black market? Why is the single most sensitive fruit the government is actively transporting just sitting in a chest on his ship, waiting for some pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast to connect the dots? I need you to hold that in your brain when we go back to Fuchsia. Because in the next part, we need to talk about what it means that Shanks brings a world-ending mythical zone into a quiet village, parks there for a year, and then, accidentally, lets the wrong D eat it. So when we cut from Fuchsia to that room in Marie-Joie during Wano, the story finally tells you what Shanks was actually babysitting. The Gorosei sit there, calmly sipping tea, while the world's strongest creature is rampaging, and they go, "Oh, by the way, did you hear? That devil fruit finally awakened." Not Kaido is a problem. Not Wano is a problem. The problem is a fruit, a single entry in their catalogue that has been giving them a migraine for 800 years. They spell it out. The Gomu Gomu no Mi has always evaded them. Over centuries. As in, the world government, with spy agencies on every sea and a monopoly on devil fruit research, has one specific fruit that keeps slipping through their fingers. And then they drop the mask and reveal the real name. HITO HITO no Mi, model NIKA, a mythical zoan. The rubber thing was never the category. It was the cover story. Here's the thing. Their fear is not that it exists. Their fear is that it awakens. They explicitly say the power is only a legend, and there is no other fruit more ridiculous. Ridiculous how? Not in combat numbers. Ridiculous in narrative terms, in symbolism, in what it does to their entire version of history if a grinning cartoon man shows up and starts turning oppression into slapstick. And they were managing it. For centuries. This is not a sin. This is normal. You let the myth rot into a joke. You let a god turn into a party trick. As long as nobody hits the mythical zone threshold, as long as nobody reaches that true form, you can tolerate a rubber man clowning around on the seas. Then we cut to CP0 on the rooftop. Luffy goes down, his heartbeat changes, and suddenly the guy who has been treating Kaido as a job assignment is sweating through his mask. The drums of liberation start. You can hear them. You can feel them. And this random government hitman's orders instantly flip from interfere with Kaido to kill that kid right now, even if it hands Kaido the win. Listen to me. That is not how you treat a strong devil fruit. That is how you treat a world order breaking symbol. The moment the drums start, we're not in a battle shonen anymore. We're in a religious crisis. And this is where the foreshadowing conversation gets uncomfortable for the community. Because Oda is very clearly retrofitting decades of rubber gags into the skin of a god. The stretched faces, the cartoon physics, the goofy resilience. On paper, that was all, ha, he's made of rubber. Post Wano, the author walks back into his own archive and says, actually, Those were the suppression limiters on a mythical Zoan the government tried to erase. Retrofitting. Intentionally. Aggressively. This is fine. The implication is brutal. From the government's perspective, the absolute worst-case scenario is exactly what happens. Not a loyal weapon. Not a controlled heir. Some unpredictable East Blue idiot with a straw hat hits Awakening in the middle of a closed country they cannot invade. And the drums they've spent 800 years trying not to hear start playing anyway. I need you to sit with that when we go back to Shanks, because suddenly his oops, the kid ate it moment, reads less as a goofy accident and more as the precise disaster the Gorosei were terrified of. So when you reframe that oops, the kid ate it moment as a world-ending failure, we need to go back to the part nobody ever wants to slow down and interrogate. Why was Shanks even there with that thing in the first place? Here's the thing. Shanks doesn't just breeze through Fuchsia, crack a few jokes and dip. He docks the Red Force in this nowhere East Blue village and stays. Months. Over a year. During that entire time, the single most sensitive devil fruit in the government's inventory is not in a vault, not with a bodyguard, not on his person. It is sitting in a random barrel in a storeroom where a hungry teenager can speedrun the apocalypse between sips of juice. Listen to me. Who's Who gets thrown in prison for losing that fruit. CP9 is escorting it. The Gorosei later talk about it as this mythical Zoan that always evades them. That is not the category of object you store next to the cooking oil and spare rope. If you understand its true nature, that is the briefcase handcuffed to your wrist. That is the gun you never put down. So why is a future Yonko-tier pirate casually chilling in a backwater with it unguarded? He was resting. He was scouting the East Blue. He just vibed with Makino's bar. I need you to hear how thin that sounds once you accept that this isn't a fun rubber fruit. It's the NIKA nuke the world government has been stress-eating over for 800 years. Resting is fine. Scouting is fine. This is normal pirate behavior. But it does not justify sailing around with the Joy Boy fruit in your junk drawer. If Shanks wanted to sell it, he could have fenced it instantly in the underworld. If he wanted power, he could have eaten it himself or handed it to a trusted officer. He does none of that. He just sits on it, in the safest, weakest sea in the world. That's where the mission theory starts to make more sense than the vacation theory. If your job is not use the fruit or trade the fruit, but keep this fruit out of circulation entirely, then parking in a quiet, low-threat region and pretending it's nothing special is suddenly very intentional storytelling. You hide the nuclear codes in the one house nobody would ever bother robbing. And then some pattern-seeking monkey with a straw hat appetite stumbles in and eats the codes. If Shanks' real assignment was containment, Fuchsia Village isn't just a cozy prologue setting. It's ground zero for a catastrophic failure. One impulsive kid, one unsecured barrel, and the weapon the world was never supposed to see again walks out of that bar smiling. Which means the next question is brutal. When Shanks sails away from that failure, who exactly is he reporting to? So let's zoom in on the crime scene. Not the big God Valley conspiracy board. The stupid little bar in Fuchsia where the entire mission goes off the rails because a hungry 12-year-old opens the wrong barrel. You remember the panel. Luffy, rummaging around, finds this unassuming cask, cracks it open, and just starts snacking. No ominous music, no heavenly choir. He's chewing with his mouth open. The crew's arguing, Makino's serving drinks, and in the corner, the most dangerous asset the world government ever classified is being eaten by a kid who still can't swim. Now, the community loves to retrofit this as destiny. See? Shanks brought the fruit there on purpose. He wanted Luffy to have it. Secret succession plan. Hidden foreshadowing. And I need you to actually read what's on the page. Shanks doesn't smile. He doesn't give a knowing nod. He doesn't say, "Ah, so you've chosen rubber, my heir." He explodes. Panic. Fury. Immediate recognition that the situation has gone from controlled to catastrophic in one bite. Here's the thing. If this was the plan, it's the worst operational security I've ever seen. If Shanks wanted Luffy to inherit the fruit, there are 100 safer, more intentional ways to do that. You sit the kid down. You explain devil fruits. You clear the room. You make sure he understands the risk, the power, the target that's about to appear on his back. You do not stash the mythical Zoan the government just lost a CP9 agent over in an unguarded barrel in a public bar and hope the pattern-seeking monkey protagonist stumbles into it during lunch. That's not mentorship. That's negligence. And Oda is not writing Shanks as negligent. So reframe that moment as what it actually is. Loss of control. This is the instant the asset he stole goes wild. The fruit that always evades the government has now slipped past even the guy who successfully robbed a government ship. From Marie-Joie's perspective, the nightmare scenario has just happened. The weapon they tried to erase didn't vanish. It reincarnated into an unpredictable, loud, de-initialed pirate fanboy in the weakest sea. And Shanks knows it. You can see it in the way the tone hard pivots. The goofy bar pirate becomes the man barking orders, demanding if Luffy understands what he's done. That's not a proud sponsor admiring his chosen champion. That's a handler staring at a mission report that just turned into a war declaration. Listen to me. Once you accept that, everything Shanks does next stops being romantic and starts reading as triage. Saving Luffy from the Sea King? That's not just heroic sacrifice. That's preventing the government's living nuke from dying in a random sea accident 10 minutes after activation. Betting his arm. Damage control. A physical receipt that anchors this failure to a new ideology he can justify to himself. Leaving the hat? That's him stapling a narrative onto a disaster. If I can't contain it, I'll at least aim it. And we need to ask the uncomfortable question. Was that really his choice? Or the only move left once Luffy took a bite? Because the next time we see Shanks making a report, he's not in a bar, he's in Marie-Joie, in front of the Gorosei, and the conversation that must have happened between those two scenes is where this entire theory either stands or collapses. Because the next time we see Shanks making a report, he's not in a bar, he's in the ocean, staring down a sea king, with one arm missing, and a problem he cannot explain to anyone. So we need to rewind that scene, because the community treats it as this pure mythic moment of mentorship. Wow, what a cool sacrifice. What a great guy. No. Zoom out. The man who just lost the world government's most protected devil fruit is now physically interposing his body between a sea king and the only irreplaceable asset left, the kid who accidentally became NIKA. He's not just saving a random boy. He's body-blocking extinction of the one host he cannot afford to lose twice. And when he stares that Sea King down, that's not just hacky flex. That's panic weaponized into resolve. He failed to guard the fruit. He will not fail to guard the vessel. There is a difference. Here's the thing. The famous "I bet it on the new era" line reads very different once you strip the romance out. Fans quote it as if Shanks intentionally drafted Luffy as Joy Boy from day one. Ah yes, a planned succession foreshadowing destiny, chef's kiss. Or, stay with me. It's a man retrofitting meaning onto a disaster he can't undo. He didn't choose Luffy as the host. Luffy chose the fruit from a barrel. Shanks is doing emotional damage control, both for the village and for himself. If you can't fix the mistake, you tell yourself it was a bet. Pattern interrupt. If Shanks really believed in that bet from the start, why does he cry when he later hears about Luffy's first bounty? That is not the face of a guy whose 4D chess is paying off. That is the face of a guy realizing the hidden weapon just fired itself into the sky. Now, the hat. Everyone reads that straw hat handoff as Roger's will being passed down. This is fine. This is normal. It absolutely functions as that symbolically. But listen to me. On a meta level, that hat is also a tracking device. Shanks is marking the boy who now carries the most dangerous fruit on the sea. He's putting a giant narrative post-it on Luffy's head. This one. Watch this one. In a story obsessed with inherited will, the author can hide a containment tag inside a sentimental heirloom and no one blinks. So why leave? Why not stay and mentor the NIKA host personally? Because Shanks is not stupid. His presence is a beacon. Yonko-adjacent pirate hangs around a tiny East Blue village for 12 more years, and you think the government, CP0, or some ambitious warlord doesn't come sniffing. The best way to protect an awakened time bomb is to make sure no one knows where the clock is. Obscurity is the armor. From this point on, his mission shifts. He can't guard the fruit directly anymore, so he guards the conditions. He keeps his distance. He shapes the political weather. He shows up at Marineford not to rescue a rookie, but to keep the world from noticing what that rookie really is. And the next time we see him in Marie-Joie, standing in front of the Gorosei, the question hanging in the air is brutal. Is he reporting that the bet is going well, or negotiating terms for a mistake that finally woke up? So here's where the community goes full conspiracy board with red string and newspaper clippings. Luffy fits the NIKA/Joy Boy archetype so perfectly that a lot of fans jump straight to, he was always destined to eat that fruit. Shanks knew. Everyone knew. It was all planned. And I need you to slow down, take a breath, and separate two completely different layers that keep getting mashed into one mushy fate smoothie. There is narrative fate. And then there is in-world logistics. Those are not the same category. Narrative fate is Oda, the author, deciding very early, my protagonist is going to be a liberator, a joy-bringing pirate messiah who breaks chains and laughs at God. That is theme. That is pre-writing. That is him reserving a liberator slot in the story's architecture long before he decides whether that role is called Joy Boy, NIKA, Sun God, or Rubber Idiot Supreme. In-world logistics is the boring, practical question. Who was actually supposed to get that fruit, if anyone? Who was that government ship transporting it for? Why was CP9 guarding it? Why do the Gorosei talk about it evading them, as if it has a track record of slipping through their fingers? That has nothing to do with destiny. That is a supply chain problem with mythology stapled on top. Here's the thing. Oda's pre-writing means he can lock in. There will be a secret god fruit that turns my hero into a cartoon chaos deity. Without locking in, it has to be this kid in this village via this Yonko babysitter handoff. He can keep the liberator slot open, then later decide, okay, it's Luffy, it's NIKA, it's this specific mythical Zoan that's been hunted since God Valley. The existence of a pre-written NIKA payoff does not magically prove that Shanks was running a 4D escort mission to feed that fruit to one specific rubber-brained 10-year-old. In fact, the story is way more interesting if Luffy is a chaotic variable who hijacks somebody else's plan. Maybe the fruit was meant for a world government weapon, a controlled Joy Boy. Maybe it was meant for some secret heir of Roger's will. Maybe Shanks himself was supposed to be the user and just didn't pull the trigger. Luffy swallowing it in a tavern is the narrative equivalent of a raccoon wandering into a nuclear lab and pressing the big red button. This is not a sin. This is normal. This is good storytelling. And listen to me. That reading actually fits the foreshadowing better. The government panic in Wano, who's who, losing his career over one theft, Shanks sitting on the fruit for over a year without using or selling it, then later walking into Marie-Joie to talk to the Gorosei about a certain pirate. All of that screams, there was a plan, and this dumb kid was not in it. So the provocative question we need to sit with is not, was Luffy destined? It's, if he hadn't eaten it, who was Shanks really holding it for? And what does that turn his meeting with the Gorosei into? A status report on a chosen successor, or damage control for the biggest screw-up of the age? Because once you ask that, you have to reread every Shanks scene as either mentorship or containment. So when you jump from Shanks maybe messed up with the fruit to Shanks is casually walking into Marie Joie for a chat, the whole story breaks in a very productive way. Because that scene, that one panel of him entering the room of authority to speak to the Gorosei about a certain pirate, that is not a cameo. That is the author grabbing you by the collar. Remember where we are. This is the Holy Land, the top floor. The room of authority is the final boss arena of politics, the place where even admirals are basically interns. And then the door opens, and in strolls a Yonko. No chains, no escort, no buster call pointed at his head. He sits down and negotiates. You and I have spent years calling the Yonko the four great emperors opposing the world government, and here one of them is getting better access than half the Marines. Here's the thing. In universe, this should be insane. A pirate with a higher bounty than most countries can get a private audience in the most secure political space on the planet. No CP0 mask in the corner, no fleet admiral looming over his shoulder. Just Shanks and the 5 guys who erase islands from maps. If you don't feel your foreshadowing alarm screaming there, I need you to turn your brain back on. And then Oda twists the knife with that single vague phrase. I've come to talk about a certain pirate. That's it. No name. The community immediately goes into pattern-seeking monkey mode, seeing Jesus in toast and Blackbeard in every shadow. Was it Teach? The walking black hole of endgame payoffs? Was it Luffy, the kid who accidentally stole the government's godfruit and is now joyfully dismantling their power structure? Was it someone else entirely? The ambiguity is not a failure to clarify, it's an intentional category of tease. It forces you to admit you don't actually know which disaster Shanks is managing. Now connect that to the theft. Who's Who tells us Shanks stole the Gomu Gomu no Mi off a government ship guarded by CP9 and got a man imprisoned for losing it. The Gorosei later reveal it was never just rubber at all, but the HITO HITO no Mi, model NIKA, a fruit that always evades them. So walk this through. The same man who jacked their most dangerous asset, the one they tried to erase from history, is now being welcomed in to consult on world-shaking threats. That is not enemies. That is a very weird kind of co-worker, which means the simple good pirate versus bad government reading collapses. Shanks starts to look less like Luffy's cool uncle and more like an unofficial gatekeeper, a freelancer they tolerate because he quietly contains catastrophes they can't control. And if that's true, then that meeting in Marie Joie isn't a random lore drop. It's either him reporting that the weapon they lost has awakened, or warning them that something even worse than NIKA is about to move. And the story quietly tells you which one, not by what Shanks says in that room, but by what he does immediately after he leaves it. Because what does he do? He walks out of Marie Joie, hears that Luffy has awakened NIKA in Wano, and instead of sprinting to put the genie back in the bottle, he says, "It's time we go meet him." That is not a heroic mentor reaction. That is not a cackling villain reaction. That is a project manager whose doomsday weapon went off ahead of schedule going, "All right, new plan." Here's the thing. The cleanest way to read Shanks is not as a secret revolutionary or a government dog. It's as a gatekeeper. Someone whose job is not to preserve the current world order forever, but to control the timing and the shape of its collapse. He's not trying to stop the new era. He's trying to regulate it so the world doesn't snap in half the second Joy Boy stands up. Look at his greatest hits through that lens, and suddenly they stop being cool coincidences and start reading as intentional crisis management. Marineford? Shanks doesn't show up early to help Whitebeard win. He intercepts Kaido first, making sure the most destructive creature on the planet does not crash the war and turn it into an extinction event. Then, when Ace is dead and Luffy is one sword swing away from being erased, Shanks ends the war. Not to save the Marines, to make sure the one unstable variable he cannot replace doesn't die on the wrong battlefield. And then you remember he's the one who stole the NIKA fruit from a government ship in the first place. Who's who gets thrown in prison for losing it? The Gorosei talk about it as a thing that evades them. That's not a gag fruit. That's a nuclear warhead that refuses to stay buried. And Shanks has been the guy standing between that warhead and the launch button. In this model, NIKA is not a fun destiny power-up. It's the final category of threat. A mythical Zoan that once awakened can literally turn the world into a cartoon of freedom. You do not want that awakening happening in the wrong era, under the wrong captain, or in the middle of the wrong war. And you can see Shanks acting on that premise over and over, keeping the fruit on his ship instead of selling it, lingering in a random East Blue village, betting his arm to push Luffy away from the sea for a while. Containment, not mentorship. Listen to me, this even reframes his personality. We joke that Shanks is just vibing, but the calm, the distance, the refusal to overreact, that's not chill dad energy. That's the effect of a man who knows exactly what one awakened fruit can do to the balance of the world and is constantly, quietly adjusting the board. When he laughs at Luffy's dream, when he watches bounties climb, when he sits in Mary Joie with the five elders, he's not surprised. He's updating a schedule, which is why Wano is his failure. Luffy awakens NIKA, not under Shanks' supervision, not on a battlefield Shanks chose, but in a chaotic four-way conflict with Kaido, Big Mom, CP0, and a country already primed to explode. The very scenario a regulator Shanks would want to prevent. From that moment on, the new era is no longer something he's pacing. It's something he has to chase. And the next time we see him, he's not watching from a bar or a coastline. He's moving. Because once your nuclear option walks off the board with a will of its own, regulation stops being a theory and becomes a race. I need you to hold on to that image of Shanks as the failed gatekeeper for a second, because when you rewind the tape back to God Valley and Roger, the pattern of what he was actually supposed to be guarding gets a lot more uncomfortable. And here's where we need to pump the brakes on the Shanks the Eternal Mastermind train and actually open Chapter 1. Not the fan edit in your head where the Gorosei are lurking behind the bar. The real first chapter Oda drew, where Shanks is a goofy guy getting bullied by mountain bandits. You meet a carefree pirate who drinks, laughs, and gets a mug smashed over his head. He inspires a weird rubber-obsessed kid. He loses an arm in a sea monster gag that suddenly isn't a gag, and he leaves behind a straw hat and a dream. That's it. No Gorosei, no God Valley flashbacks, no whispered joy boy. The stakes are emotional, not geopolitical. Listen to me, that's not an accident, but it's also not a 4D NIKA handler scene. At this stage, Shanks is clearly operating in what I called the pre-writing category. He's a symbol. He is freedom in a red coat. He is inherited will in physical form. He's the walking thesis statement for the new era, not a fully specced out agent in a Joy Boy containment operation. Foreshadowing in the strict sense would mean Oda intentionally embedded concrete information in that chapter that only makes sense once you know about the HITO HITO no Mi, model, NIKA, the five elders, and Shanks' future audience with them. But when you actually scan those early pages, what do you see? A hat. A ship, a bar, a kid crying because his hero is leaving. There are no specific hints about government connections, no weird panel emphasis on a treasure chest, no dialogue about a special fruit that must never awaken. The focus is feeling. The storytelling priority is, this kid's life was changed by this man, not this man is running a classified mission. And this is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, how a smart author protects their future options. You establish the archetype first, you bolt the politics on later. Here's the thing, that emotionally pure introduction gives Oda absurd flexibility in retrospect. Because Shanks is defined symbolically, not bureaucratically, You can retrofit him into almost any political role without contradicting what's on the page. Secret celestial dragon. Works. Traitor who sold out Roger's will. Painful but works. Guardian who was supposed to deliver the fruit to someone else. Also works. Gatekeeper who failed to stop a random kid from hijacking destiny. We just spent a whole section on that. I need you to see the category difference here. Pre-writing Shanks is a mythic mentor. Later, Shanks is a political actor. When fans point at Chapter 1 and say, "See, Oda always planned him as NIKA's handler," that's our pattern-seeking monkey brain seeing Jesus in toast. The author planned the symbol. The NIKA logistics were retrofitted onto that symbol once the endgame machinery solidified. And once you accept that, going back to Shanks stealing that fruit from a government ship stops being proof of eternal genius and starts being something way more interesting. A pivot. A decision. The moment Oda chooses which version of Shanks he's actually going to cash in. So when Oda pivots, he doesn't just pivot Shanks's backstory. He pivots Shanks's entire job description. And Marineford is where you finally see the updated role in action. In 4K, no deniability. Oh, this is what this man actually does, clarity. Shanks doesn't drift into Marineford. He crash lands into the climax of the war, blocks Akainu's punch aimed at Kobe, and then just tells everyone to stop. That's it. No army, no kaiju. Just a guy with a sword and a reputation saying, "The war ends here." And both the Whitebeard remnants and the Marines treat that sentence as binding law. You and I are pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast. But even we have to admit, that is not normal. Because here's the thing. The narrative does not frame him as an escalation. He's not Blackbeard rolling in to farm corpses and chaos. He's the brakes. He steps in at the exact moment the war is about to turn from tragic to irrecoverable. When Akainu is still hunting Luffy, Blackbeard is testing his new toy, and the whole power balance is wobbling. The author stages him as a reset button, not a new threat. And I need you to notice how personal that reset is around one unconscious rubber idiot. In the middle of a war about Whitebeard, Ace, and the age of Roger, Shanks' first concrete action after the entrance flex is secure Luffy's body. He has Ben and the others form a perimeter. He negotiates the retrieval of the dead and the wounded. He explicitly guarantees safe passage for Luffy, who, on paper at that point, is just a rookie with a D, a 300 million bounty, and a paramecia that stretches. If you read that scene in 2010, it scans as mentor protecting the protagonist. This is fine. This is normal. But once you know the Gorosei classify that fruit as a mythical zoan the government has been chasing for centuries, and CP0 panics the second Gear 5 goes off, that Marineford panel retrofits itself. Shanks isn't only shielding a promising kid, he's body-blocking the one vessel that absolutely cannot die on that battlefield or be dissected in a marine lab. This is where his role crystallizes into a new category in the story's power system. Not hero, not villain, but gatekeeper. He doesn't roam around starting conflicts. He appears when the scale tips so far that the pre-written endgame is in danger of snapping. At Marineford, that danger is the NIKA fruit being erased or reclaimed before it awakens. In other words, the exact opposite of what the world government wants, and potentially the exact opposite of what his original mission was supposed to ensure. Listen to me. Once you see Shanks as the man who stops wars, you have to ask a worse question. What war is he actually trying to stop? The one on the battlefield? Or the one that would start if the wrong person realized what fruit Luffy was carrying? And that's where his next move, the one no Yonko should be able to make, blows this whole gatekeeper thing wide open. Because then we cut away from the politics and get what looks on the surface like a wholesome reaction image. Shanks on the deck of the Red Force, bounty poster in hand, that now iconic grin staring back at him. He laughs. He straight up cries. The whole crew is clowning on the number, and he just says it. You've become a great pirate. On first watch, your brain files this under mentor proud of student and moves on. This is fine. This is normal. That reading still works. Here's the thing. That's the safe reading. That's the version you get if you pretend Gear 5 never happened and the Gorosei aren't sweating over a rubber cartoon character. In that straightforward category, it's Shanks seeing his hat's new owner step onto the stage, seeing Roger's will carried forward, seeing the kid who bet his arm on a dream actually make it out of East Blue. Clean, emotional, no conspiracy board required. But we don't live in that timeline anymore. We live in the post-NIKA, post-Who's Who exposition dump era, where the Gomu Gomu no Mi is officially the HITO HITO no Mi, model NIKA, a mythical Zoan. The government has been trying and failing to control for centuries. We know Shanks stole that exact fruit off a heavily guarded government ship. We know CP9 agents went to prison for losing it. So when Shanks is staring at that poster, he's not just seeing a kid. He's seeing the public face of the failure that started in Fuchsia Village. I need you to actually sit with that for a second. That goofy grin is now printed, mass-produced, and stapled to tavern walls across the world. For a man who once treated that fruit like a nuclear warhead that needed to stay in his hands, this is not just a hallmark moment. It's an alarm bell. The new era he accidentally unleashed is no longer a rumor in East Blue. It's a wanted man with a name, a bounty, and a very recognizable silhouette. So, those tears. You can absolutely read them as pride. You should. Shanks is happy that Luffy didn't die, that his gamble on the next generation didn't end with some marine report about a rubber kid at the bottom of the sea. But layered on top of that, there's dread. Because once that poster exists, there is no putting NIKA back in the barrel. The world government doesn't have to guess anymore. They can track that smile. Pattern interrupt. What if that scene isn't Shanks celebrating a victory, but grieving the point of no return? The moment he realizes every future move he makes, from Marineford to that meeting with the Gorosei, has to account for the fact that Joy Boy is now a traceable asset. And this is where Oda's retrofitting skill goes from neat coincidence to weaponized. On its own, the scene is already doing its job. Mentor, legacy, tears, done. But once you plug in the NIKA reveal, the political stakes, the God Valley history, it becomes a double exposed photograph. One image of pure emotional payoff. One image of a man who just watched his greatest failure get a barcode. Listen to me. This is not a sin. This is not Oda cheating. This is exactly how a pre-written endgame and later retrofits can coexist. The author can plan the emotional spine of a scene, then quietly bolt new meaning onto it years later without breaking the original. Which means we need to go one step further and ask the uncomfortable question the bounty poster forces onto the table. If Shanks is crying at the sight of Luffy's face, who exactly does he think is going to be looking back at that poster from the other side? If Shanks is staring at that poster and seeing someone else, we need to talk about rubber. Because on paper, my body is bouncy is the least godlike power you could give a future messiah. From chapter 1, Oda weaponizes that. Bullets bounce off Luffy, and the reaction is not, oh no, an invincible warrior has arrived. It's, that's weird. In Orangetown, Buggy is clowning on him, literally, with cannonballs and chop-chop gags. In Arlong Park, Luffy's big weakness is he can't swim and he gets stuck in concrete. Logetown, he gets struck by lightning and everyone treats it as cartoon timing, not divine intervention. The story keeps telling you this is silly, this is a joke. Except here's the thing. Every single one of those jokes quietly builds a vocabulary. Rubber means impact negation, sure, but it also means storage, recoil, elasticity. Luffy getting flattened, twisted, inflated, snapped back. Is Oda stress testing the same core property over and over until you, the reader, stop questioning it? This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is pre-writing through slapstick. Then Oda starts cashing it in. Eni's lobby. The rocket from the Tower of Justice to the courthouse roof is literally, what if my friend is a human slingshot? Thriller bark. He turns himself into a balloon to expel Moria's shadows and scream sunlight into existence. Fishman Island. The water pressure training plus COA gives you those ridiculous underwater punches that travel through the ocean because rubber can stretch that far, right? The community calls these hype moments, but structurally, they're receipts. The author is saying, you already accepted the absurd version, so the extreme version is fine. Listen to me, that is not foreshadowing in the narrow, gun on the mantelpiece sense. That is Oda building a toolbox. Gomu Gomu is a power that can live in two categories at once. It is a gag power when he needs comedic timing. It is a serious power when he needs a clutch solution. And because the underlying rule is always, his body does impossible rubber things, he can escalate from pistol to bazooka to giant to borderline reality bending without ever technically breaking the initial contract. Which is why Gear 5 does not feel, emotionally, like a total retrofit. Fans will argue about the taxonomy forever, but on the page, Luffy turning the ground into rubber, bouncing lightning, swinging his arms through the sky, reads as the ultimate extension of what you already know. This man's body refuses to obey normal physics. NIKA is not overwriting Gomu Gomu. NIKA is saying, oh, that nonsense had a name. It reframes the joke as a mask over a deeper, always there absurdity. And now circle back to Shanks. He is the one who walks into Fuchsia with this pre-written gag tool in a box. He is not a priest delivering a sacred relic with solemn exposition. He is a guy whose crew uses the rubber kid as party entertainment until the ultimate joke power accidentally gets eaten. I need you to see the difference there. Shanks doesn't inaugurate Joy Boy. He loses control of a fruit designed to be underestimated, a power built to hide godhood under pratfalls. Which is exactly why when that same rubber goofball hits the front page, Shanks' smile is not simple pride. It's recognition that the long con of Gomu Gomu has finally run out of room to pretend it's ordinary. So if Shanks is staring at that bounty poster and seeing the mask fall off, we need to ask the uncomfortable question, whose mask was supposed to be under there in the first place? If Luffy wasn't meant to be Joy Boy, then who was Shanks actually holding that fruit for? Because listen to me, you don't rob a CP9 guarded government transport of a top priority devil fruit, sit on it for over a decade, and then just leave it in a barrel next to the snacks. That's not a pirate prank. That's an intentional custody arrangement gone horribly off script. So, option 1, Shanks is a courier, not in the Uber Eats for Gorosei sense, but in the unofficial custodian sense. The government can't keep NIKA in Mariajoie because it keeps evading them, so they outsource the problem to the one Yonko adjacent guy who can move freely, has Roger clout, and doesn't seem interested in conquering the world. Shanks keeps it off the board, far from ambitious marines and idiot pirates, until the elders are sure they can lock it down. This is not a sin, by the way. Using a pirate as a safety deposit box is exactly the kind of morally cursed workaround this story loves. But here's the thing. There's a second, nastier possibility that's actually more romantic in a one-piece sense. Shanks isn't holding it for the government. He's holding it for a candidate. Someone aligned with Roger's will. Someone he hasn't met yet. The way Rayleigh sits in Sabaody waiting for the right rookie crew, Shanks could be drifting through the East Blue with a god in a chest, testing people, poking at kids, waiting for the one person whose dream feels enough Roger adjacent that you risk detonating the world. Except, Luffy doesn't get a test. He just eats the thing. No D-clan vetting. No can you hear the voice of all things exam. Just a hungry 12-year-old treating a mythical zone as dessert. Which tells you the plan, whatever it was, got hijacked by the universe's worst timing. And that leads to the third category. Maybe the intended host wasn't a person at all. Maybe it was an era. The fruit isn't supposed to be worn. It's supposed to be stored. Shanks's real mission is to keep NIKA dormant until the right convergence of ancient weapons, void century revelations, and pirate age chaos. The host is the calendar. The trigger is the news cycle. Luffy, being Luffy, speedruns destiny by a decade because he can't keep his hands off mystery food. I need you to see the pattern here. Every plausible version of this story has Shanks managing the fruit, guarding it, timing it, or saving it for someone specific. What it never supports is the community's cozy headcanon, where he just shrugs and gambles the apocalypse on a random village kid. Which raises the real problem. If Shanks was a gatekeeper, why does he later walk into Mariajois and talk to the very people who wanted NIKA erased? Because that question dumps us straight onto the one island the story keeps trying to pretend never existed. God Valley. We need to sit with what God Valley actually is in the text. Not a cool backdrop. Not a random flashback arena. A massive collision of categories. Rox D. Zebek and his freak show lineup. Roger's crew. Garp. Celestial dragons. And enslaved civilians all stacked on one disappearing island that afterward is so thoroughly erased it falls off the map. The author doesn't just say it was destroyed. He has characters act confused the island ever existed. That is an intentional narrative red flag. Here's the thing. When One Piece pretends history doesn't exist, that usually means Joy Boy is somewhere under the floorboards. The Void Century, O'Hara's books, Fishman Island's prophecy, Laugh Tale itself. Every time the world government-shaped shredder comes out, the pattern is the same. Joy Boy, NIKA, or someone wearing that narrative costume is the problem they're trying to delete. Now drop Shanks into that. We're told he was found as a baby in a treasure chest on a God Valley-related raid by Roger's crew. That's not a cute anecdote. That is the author stapling Shanks' birth to the single most aggressively censored incident in modern history. A baby in a chest in the middle of a celestial dragon hunting ground and a Rox Roger Garp war. I need you to hear how insane that is as an oops random orphan explanation. Pattern interrupt. What if the most important thing in that chest wasn't treasure, and it wasn't even Shanks? What if it was a vacancy? Because if God Valley is a Joy Boy cleanup operation, then something Joy Boy adjacent probably died there. A previous NIKA host. A failed Joy Boy candidate. A mythical Zoan user whose existence had to be erased so thoroughly that the island itself went with them. The Gorosei later complain that the NIKA fruit always evades them. That is not a one-off gag. That sounds like a centuries-long game of tag where the fruit keeps slipping out of their category of control at the worst possible moments. So imagine this. God Valley is one of those moments. The government tries a massive reset of Joy Boy-related threats. Rox is there chasing secrets. Roger is there chasing the same. In the chaos, a NIKA host dies, or the fruit changes hands, or the bloodline tied to that power gets stuffed into a box and smuggled out. Roger opens a chest, expecting treasure, and finds a red-haired infant whose existence is already a crime. From that point on, Shanks' entire life is entangled with that erasure project. He's literally a byproduct of a Joy Boy suppression event. He grows up under the man who reaches Laugh Tale, hears the real story, and laughs anyway. He then becomes the guy who just happens to rob a government ship of the one fruit they cannot afford to lose, and just happens to be the one Yonko the Gorosei will privately receive in Mariajois. Listen to me, that's not random, that's structural. The same hands that tried to delete God Valley are now shaking hands with the baby that incident accidentally produced. Which is where the tragedy kicks in, because if Shanks is a walking echo of God Valley, then Fuchsia Village is history doing a speed run of the exact cycle that island tried to end. The child of a world-erasing incident grows up into the man tasked formally or informally, with keeping NIKA caged. And then, in a nowhere village, on a lazy day, he slips. The fruit evades them again. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is Oda weaponizing pre-writing. The gun on the mantle at God Valley goes off in a bar in East Blue. And once you see that, Shanks's visit to the Gorosei stops being a quirky flex and starts reading as damage control. And once you see that, Shanks' visit to the Gorosei stops being a quirky flex and starts reading as damage control. Because listen to me, that room is not about a rubber kid. That room is about a centuries-long losing streak against a ghost in their own history. So we need to zoom out. Joy Boy, NIKA, the drums of liberation. This is not just cool mythos DLC. Oda slapped on in Wano. In the internal logic of the story, this is the oldest patch note in the game. A legendary liberator who promised the fishmen a future on the surface, who left a hat in a frozen vault, who keeps getting whispered about whenever oppression gets too loud. Joy Boy is the historical scar. NIKA is the God-shaped bandage the oppressed invented to cope with that scar. Here's the thing, the HITO HITO no Mi model. NIKA is what happens when you take that entire myth category, freedom, laughter, rubber reality, drums that make slaves dance instead of kneel, and you compress it into one human nervous system. That is the world government's nightmare. Not an ancient weapon, not a battleship, but one idiot with cartoon physics and an ideological aura that turns on every pair of shackles in a 5-mile radius. Foreshadowing-wise, Oda telegraphs this as a structural problem, not a one-off panic. The Gorosei don't say, wow, what an unfortunate coincidence. They say the fruit always evades us. Always. That one adverb tells you this is not their first rodeo. That line retroactively implies centuries of failed ops. Cypherpole units disappearing, ships sunk, custodians mysteriously dying right before transfer. You can almost hear some exhausted archivist in Mario Joie writing, subject, NIKA, status, still trolling us. And then you plug Shanks into that timeline. Who's Who tells you the government finally gets cautious, slaps CP9 on escort duty, and moves the fruit in secret. Top priority asset, maximum security, and a red-haired pirate just walks in and steals it. That's not a goofy prologue gag anymore. That's the latest entry in a multi-century L column. Government tries to cage freedom. Freedom trips them down the stairs. Except it gets worse, because Shanks then proceeds to lose the same fruit to a child in a bar in the weakest sea. From a pure storytelling perspective, this is almost too on the nose. It feels absurd until you remember Oda's whole deal with pre-writing and intentional symmetry. The gun on the mantle has been dodging their hand for 800 years, and now it rolls under the table and into Luffy's mouth. Once you frame it that way, Shanks's theft stops being random piracy and becomes participation in a generational custody battle. Who gets to define freedom? The government that wants NIKA erased, or the pirates and outcasts who keep accidentally resurrecting him? I need you to see how consistent this is. Joy Boy's promise, Fishman discrimination, O'Hara's books, Poseidon's birth, Luffy's fruit. It's one argument, told in different fonts. And if Shanks is in that argument on purpose, not by accident, then his failure in Fuchsia and his cozy chat with the Gorosei start to read as two halves of the same move. Which raises the real question we have to tackle next. Whose side has he actually been on this entire time? So if Shanks is part of that argument on purpose, we need to go back to where he first walks on stage. East Blue, Fuchsia Village, no Gorosei, no God Valley, no NIKA. Just a no-name bar, a no-name kid, and a Yonko in training wasting a year in the boonies. Why? What is he actually doing there? Run it chronologically. First, the bar scenes with Makino. Shanks is clowning around, spilling booze, letting his crew act like the fun uncle at a wedding. Higuma walks in, insults him to his face, smashes a bottle on his head. Shanks laughs it off. He jokes. He lets himself get humiliated in front of Luffy. On a surface read, this is Mentor pre-writing 101. Demonstrate to the kid that pride is cheap and people are more important than ego. The author is clearly setting up Luffy's moral compass, not some galaxy brain NIKA gambit. Except here's the thing. Once you know the fruit in that treasure chest is the government's nightmare mythical zone, the vibe shifts. A Yonko tier pirate with a world-ending secret on his ship is choosing not to escalate a bar brawl. That same calm suddenly reads as operational security. Don't blow your cover. Don't draw Marines. Don't risk the cargo. Is that foreshadowing of a gatekeeper role, or just an example of us being pattern-seeking monkeys who see Joy Boy in every panel? You tell me. Then there's the time spent in the village. A whole year. For a man who, retroactively, has stolen the most important fruit on the planet, that's insane. On the page, originally, it's pure pre-writing. Oda needs enough time for Luffy to bond with Shanks, absorb his ethos, and earn that hat. It's the classical mentor stay. But under the NIKA lens, that year can be reclassified as a stakeout. Guarding the fruit. Laying low in the safest backwater imaginable. That's not confirmed, but it's a category shift. From cool pirate hanging out to agent sitting on a nuke. Now the big one. The fruit scene. Luffy eats it. Shanks freezes, then explodes in horror. That panel reads completely differently post 1.0. Before, fans reasonably saw it as a gag with consequences. Oh no, kid ate our treasure, guess he's rubber now. That's borderline retrofit territory. Oda can dial the panic up or down later. After NIKA, that horror scans as the one moment in East Blue that feels intentionally keyed to a larger plan. This is not a sin, this is normal. You write a flexible beat, then decide 15 years later how radioactive it actually was. Listen to me. These scenes still work perfectly if you know nothing about NIKA. The emotional core is airtight. Shanks is the ideal adult Luffy wants to become. The hat, the arm, the ship leaving the horizon. None of that needs secret fruit lore to land. That's exactly why the retrofitting works. The scaffolding was strong. So no, East Blue doesn't prove Shanks groomed Luffy to be Joy Boy. It proves Oda built a Shanks-shaped wildcard he could later plug into the NIKA conflict without breaking anything. And if Fuchsia is the controlled lab test, then the next time we see Shanks with that same kid and that same hat, the moment of their reunion becomes the stress test. Because what does the gatekeeper do when the door actually walks back to him? So when that door finally walks back to him, it's not in a cozy village bar. It's in the middle of the single most chaotic meat grinder in the series, Marineford. And I need you to actually replay that sequence in your head, not the headcanon version the community has been running on. Luffy charges in, burns his lifespan, gets Impel Down's worst on his side, and then collapses after Ace dies. He is done. He is a corpse in waiting in the middle of 3 admirals, Blackbeard, Sengoku, Garp, Mihawk, and a world government that would very much prefer the Will of D problem to solve itself. And then, in the middle of that dogpile, a red-haired arm just casually scoops him up out of the ocean. Here's the thing. Shanks doesn't just catch his unconscious body. He immediately orders his crew to protect him. Beckman has a gun on Kizaru, Rue is covering angles, everyone's formation orbits around this one rubber kid. We're in a war between the world's strongest forces, and the narrative priority becomes, do not let anything touch the boy. That's not fan service. That's an author underlining in red pen. Now watch what Shanks doesn't do. He doesn't stay to fight. He doesn't chase revenge for Ace, doesn't try to kill Teach, doesn't press the advantage when the Marines are exhausted. He walks into the endgame board and then refuses to play chess. He ends the war, returns the bodies, issues a threat, and leaves, as if his objective was never to win. It was to stop the simulation from crashing. If your category for this is Shanks really cares about Luffy, this is fine. This is normal. But with the NIKA context, that explanation suddenly feels underwritten. Because the government isn't panicking over a kid who punched a celestial dragon. They're panicking over the one mythical zone that always evades them. The same fruit Shanks stole from a government ship. The same fruit Who's Who went to prison for losing. The same fruit whose awakening literally rewrites physics. So when Shanks is shielding Luffy's limp body with an Emperor's crew, he's not just protecting a boy. He's ensuring the continued existence of the one devil fruit that must not be captured or killed in the chaos. Marineford is God Valley in miniature, a powder keg of top tiers and a single world-altering asset in the blast radius. And remember, by this point, Shanks has had years to sit with his failure in Fuchsia. Years to process that the weapon he was presumably transporting for someone else ended up in the stomach of a 10-year-old. Marineford is his second chance to do the job correctly. Keep NIKA out of government hands, no matter whose body it's wearing. Pattern interrupt. Notice who moves first. Not Garp, not Dragon, not the Revolutionary Army. The gatekeeper. Shanks appears exactly at the inflection point where the fruit's host is at maximum risk and the board is crowded with pieces strong enough to erase him by accident. That's not random timing. That's planned intervention. Which means if we're treating Shanks as a gatekeeper, Marineford becomes Exhibit A. And the real question isn't, why did he stop the war? It's, who was he really reporting to when he made sure Joy Boy walked out alive? Because once you see Marineford as gatekeeping, you cannot unsee what happens in Wano. We go from Shanks manually yanking Joy Boy off the chessboard to the moment the board explodes in his face. Run the scene in your head. Kaido caves Luffy's skull in. The narration doesn't flinch. His heartbeat stops. We sit in that horrible, silent panel where the future Pirate King is just gone. No inner monologue. No last speech. Just a body cooling on the rooftop. And then, out of nowhere, the sound effect Oda has been saving for 25 years. The dum-da-da-dum of the drums of liberation. That is not a power-up. That is a category error. The story itself flips from boy with a rubber fruit to mythical entity whose heartbeat is a soundtrack. And Oda doesn't even let you breathe before he cuts away to the Gorosei. Here's the thing. They do not say, oh no, Luffy awakened his paramecia. They say, that fruit. The one that always evades them. The one whose real name they have intentionally buried for centuries. HITO HITO no Mi. Model. NIKA. So when fans tell me Gear 5 was some random late decision, I need you to remember that the highest authority in the story has a pre-written panic button for this exact event. They have a meeting script. They have a vocabulary. They have a suppression plan. That is the author waving a neon sign that Shanks has been sitting on an information time bomb, not a gag rubber fruit. Now, Shanks is a Yonko. He has spies in Mariejois. He has a private audience with the Gorosei. He absolutely hears that in Wano, a rookie with a straw hat and a scar he personally gifted just rang the NIKA alarm. Even off-screen, that information would hit him faster than you doom-scrolling Twitter at 2 a.m. And if his long-term mission was to keep that fruit contained until the right moment or vessel, Wano is the nightmare scenario. From Shanks' perspective, the worst possible branch of the decision tree has just fired. The fruit he stole from a government ship. The fruit he failed to keep out of a random kid's mouth. The fruit he then protected through East Blue, through Eni's lobby, through Marineford, has finally awakened in a pirate who is now punching emperors and indirectly declaring war on the world government's founding lie. This is not a sin on Shanks' part. This is not incompetence. This is the planned risk of treating a god fruit as a wait-and-see weapon. But the bill has come due, and we need to ask the only question that matters now. What is Shanks's next intentional move? Does he step in as Joy Boy's sponsor, as the cool uncle of the new era? Does he try to steer Luffy, nudge the writing of history so NIKA serves a manageable revolution? Or, if the drums of liberation threaten to burn the world faster than his mysterious agenda can handle, is Shanks prepared to do the unthinkable and aim his sword at the very boy he once saved? Because the drums are already beating. The only thing we do not know is whether Shanks plans to dance or cut the music. So when we ask whether Shanks plans to dance or cut the music, we need to talk about the stage he's walking onto right now, Elbaf, and yes, even Film Red. Because the series has quietly been upgrading Shanks from cool mentor who lost an arm to mythological bouncer of the entire new era, and the recent material is where that really crystallizes. First, Film Red. I know, semi-canon, marketing vehicle, Yuta's hair defies physics, all of that. This is fine, this is normal. But even with canon caveats, the author is still telling you something about how you should read this man. In that movie, Shanks is simultaneously the most doting dad on the planet and a guy who will absolutely greenlight mass memory erasure and battlefield-level collateral if that's what it takes to stop a global threat. He hugs Yuta. He also stands there ready to let her die to save the world. That's not a contradiction. That's the point. The story is stress testing how far his greater good calculation goes. Now put that portrayal next to the manga Shanks who hovers at the edge of Wano, refuses to actually meet Luffy, and then immediately pivots toward Elbaf. Listen to me, this is not Shanks wandering around the map because the author forgot where to park him. This is intentional positioning at mythological pressure points. Wano is the closed nation tied to Joy Boy's prophecy and the borders of the world. Elbaf is the island of giants, Norse-coded war gods, and the biggest library of ancient history we haven't seen yet. Shanks is camping on the ley lines of the setting, and then he drops the line that should have detonated the community's brain cells. It's time we go meet him. Not, oh wow, Luffy awakened, guess we should say hi. A decision. A switch flipping. For years, Shanks has been the guy who intercepts Kaido, who walks into Marineford, who talks to the Gorosei, all to regulate the tempo of history without ever confronting the NIKA candidate head-on. Suddenly, post-Wano, post-awakening, he stops gatekeeping from the balcony and walks onto the stage. This is the culmination of his gatekeeper arc. The bouncer has to open the door and actually check the ID. He can't just keep nudging events so the right kind of new era shows up. Now the new era has a face, a drum beat, and a tune force. So what does he do with that? We need to entertain all three options because the foreshadowing supports all of them. Does he intend to test Luffy to see whether this Joy Boy is the kind of liberator who frees people without tearing the sky itself? Does he intend to ally, to stand beside NIKA as the final guarantor that the revolution doesn't get hijacked by Blackbeard, Emu, or whatever nightmare is sleeping under Elbaf's roots? Or is he the last failsafe, the man who will swing his blade at Joy Boy if the sun god threatens to burn the world past the point of recovery? And here's the thing. Elbaf is where those intentions can't hide anymore. Because the one secret Shanks has been orbiting for decades. Elbaf might be the first place it finally talks back. So before we sail into Elbaf and demand answers from a bunch of 12-story Vikings, we need to have an uncomfortable conversation with the fandom. Specifically, the Shanks chose Joy Boy comfort fanfic that has wrapped itself around this story like a weighted blanket. You know the one. Shanks knew it was NIKA, saw Luffy's spirit, and in his infinite red-haired wisdom, he entrusted the fruit to the next generation. On paper, it's gorgeous. Shanks, the all-knowing mentor. Luffy, the destined successor. The hat, the arm, the fruit. One perfect, intentional ceremony. This is the version where Shanks is basically Dumbledore with better drip. He strolls into Fuchsia with the sun god in a briefcase, takes one look at this rubber-brained kid and goes, "Ah yes, Joy Boy speedrun. Let's go." Now, listen to me. That is not what the manga shows you. At all. In the actual text, Shanks does not perform a ritual. He leaves the most important fruit in the world in an unguarded barrel in a random village bar. Luffy eats it off screen. When Shanks finds out, he does not nod sagely about inherited will. He panics. He grabs the kid. He screams. That is not the reaction of a man who just executed a 20-year plan. That is the reaction of a guy who realized the nuclear launch codes were on the coffee table. Compare that to the government side. Who's who gets jailed for losing this fruit? CP9 was guarding it. The Gorosei later talk about this thing as a mythical zoan that evades them, and when they realize Luffy has it, CP0 is ordered to drop everything and kill him mid-Kaido. If Shanks chose Joy Boy, why is every other power structure treating this as a catastrophic accident? Here's the thing. This is where our foreshadowing/retrofitting/pre-writing categories get scrambled in the community. Oda absolutely pre-wrote NIKA. He absolutely planted sun god imagery and just rubber gags as foreshadowing. But the headcanon that Shanks intentionally fed Luffy the fruit? That's us retrofitting motive onto a scene that was originally written as a screw-up. This is not a sin. This is not bad reading. This is normal. Your brain wants order. It wants Shanks to be a wise guardian executing a planned handoff, because that means the world is curated, intentional, safe. The problem is that it flattens him into a stock mentor archetype and quietly erases the most interesting part of his role. I need you to consider a different category. Shanks as a fallible gatekeeper who failed his mission. Suddenly his long stay in Fuchsia isn't a leisurely vibe check with Makino. It's a man stalling, guarding a fruit he doesn't dare sell, eat or deliver yet. Suddenly Luffy isn't the chosen one. He's a chaos factor who hijacks a cosmic weapon that was supposed to be contained. Pattern interrupt. What if the story is better that way? Because if Shanks didn't choose Joy Boy, then Elbaf, the Gorosei meeting, and that tearful reaction to Marineford Luffy aren't the victory lap of a mastermind. They're the damage control of a man whose greatest failure might also be the world's last hope. And that version? That's the one the next section needs to unpack. So if we're saying Shanks failed, we need to do the boring, grown-up thing and actually check the receipts. I need you to resist the urge to turn Oda into this omniscient sea god who whispered the word NIKA into a conch shell in 1997. We have comments. We have SBS. We have publication history. That's our sandbox. Here's the thing. When Oda talks about planning, he's very specific about some pillars and very fuzzy about others. He said multiple times he had the ending, the big mysteries, and the general shape of the story planned before serialization. Void Century, One Piece itself, Will of D, that category. When fans ask about ultra-granular stuff, he often laughs it off or says he only decided later. This is normal. This is not a sin. This is how long-form writing works when you're not a time-traveling spreadsheet. On Shanks and Luffy's fruit specifically, Oda has never gone on record with, "Yes, from chapter 1 I knew it was the HITO HITO no Mi. Model NIKA and Shanks was carefully grooming Joy Boy." What he has said is that he chose rubber for Luffy because it was a funny power that would be entertaining to draw in fights. Not cool, not godly, but comedic and expressive. That's a gag-first design philosophy, not a divine prophecy. If you line that up with publication timing, the pattern is pretty clear. Gear 2 and Gear 3 are Oda squeezing every drop out of Dumb Rubber Kid. Skypiea introduces sun motifs and drums and a certain silhouette, but there's zero textual insistence that Luffy is secretly a mythic being. The NIKA name, the Gorosei's panic, Who's Who's backstory, the It Always Evades Us mythology, all that drops decades later, in a very tight cluster. That's not foreshadowing in the pure sense. That's a retrofit built on a pre-written gag base. And listen to me. Retrofit is not a dirty word. Oda himself has admitted in SBS that he sometimes discovers connections after the fact, or reuses old elements in new ways once he realizes they fit. He'll say he decided later that a silhouette was actually so-and-so, or that a technique was always hacky. He almost never claims, with a straight face, that every micro-detail was planned from day one. The only people who talk that way are fans and the occasional pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast and calls it evidence. Crucially, there is no comment anywhere that Shanks always knew the fruit's true nature or that he was on some ordained Deliver Joy Boy mission. Oda has not said Shanks met the Gorosei to report on Luffy. He has not said Shanks stole the fruit on behalf of Imu. Those are our theories, not author statements. So we need to be honest about the category we're in. What I'm arguing here is an interpretation anchored in what Oda has said. Rubber chosen for comedy, big mysteries pre-written, and what he stayed silent on. The Shanks as fallible gatekeeper who lost control of a weapon reading fits those receipts far better than the omniscient Shanks myth. Which then raises the real question the next section has to answer. If NIKA is a retrofit, when did Oda decide it? And what does the timeline of that decision do to Shanks' supposed master plan? So when we say, okay, NIKA was probably decided around here on the timeline, I can already feel some of you vibrating in the comments. Because we are pattern-seeking monkeys. We see faces in clouds, Jesus in toast, and a 30-year master plan in every coincidental panel alignment. You see Shanks crying over Luffy's first bounty, and your brain goes, aha! Proof he always knew. Foreshadowing. You see that one panel where Kid Luffy is stretching in the sun, and suddenly it's, Oda planned the sun god silhouette in 1997. I need you to hear this. Your brain is doing that, not the manga. This is normal. This is fine. Here's the thing. Once you buy into Oda planned literally everything, confirmation bias kicks in and never clocks out. You only register evidence that supports the myth. The Gorosei calling the fruit HITO HITO no Mi model NIKA, planned from chapter 1. Who's who going to prison because Shanks stole that exact fruit? Planned from God Valley. Any contradiction, any industry constraint, any interview where Oda admits he changed something, your brain quietly drags it to the recycle bin. And that's a problem, not because it's morally wrong, but because it flattens the categories we spent this whole video building. Foreshadowing, retrofitting, pre-writing, they all get dumped into one big bucket labeled 4D chess. The difference between I intentionally planted this and I cleverly repurposed this later disappears. The author stops being a working human and becomes a prophecy machine. When you do that, you actually erase Oda's real craft. It is easy, in theory, to follow a rigid outline. It is much harder to be 20 years in. Notice that Shanks once did a goofy dragon gag with Kinemon and retrofit it into 1-0 trauma so cleanly that it feels intentional. It is much harder to take early mantra and pre-written hacky notes and weave them into a unified system without breaking the story. That's not divine foresight. That's ruthless revision and opportunistic storytelling. Think back to the examples we already walked through. Laboon and Brook? That's genuine pre-writing. Two halves of a promise decided together. Sanji's Mr. Prince and North Blue origin, foreshadowing for the Vinsmoke reveal. But Shanks stumbling into Fuchsia with a stolen government fruit and hanging around for a year? That reads way more retrofitted once NIKA enters the chat. The Shanks-Gorosei meeting. That's Oda taking his upgraded understanding of the fruit and back projecting it onto an emperor he's always kept mysterious. Listen to me. Calling all of that foreshadowing isn't a compliment. It's lazy criticism. It refuses to do the work of asking, When could an author reasonably have planned this? It refuses to see the dance between intent and discovery. A healthier lens is to enjoy that dance, to appreciate that Shanks and Luffy's relationship hit so hard precisely because it doesn't read as a neat, preordained contract between Joy Boy and his handler. It feels messy, human, contingent, a fallible man who lost control of a weapon and then decided to believe in the kid anyway. And once you stop forcing everything into the foreshadowing category, you can finally ask the actually terrifying question: if this wasn't all planned from the start, then what exactly has Shanks been doing every time he steps on stage? So here's where we need to reframe the entire conversation about Oda, the omniscient God King who planned everything in 1997. I need you to put that image down for a second. Not because Oda isn't a meticulous planner, but because that myth actually makes you miss what he's really doing with Shanks and NIKA. Recap the 3 categories in your head. Category 1, genuine foreshadowing. That's your short to mid-term setups where the author actually knows the payoff. Laboon and Brook. Sanji's North Blue origin and bounty weirdness pointing to the Vinsmokes. Early hacky hints from Skypiea that were clearly intentional, clearly planned. The information is seeded because the author already has a specific later scene in mind. Category 2, retrofitting. This is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is, in fact, where NIKA and the government panic mostly live. Who's backstory about the Gomu Gomu no Mi being guarded by CP9, the Gorosei saying the fruit always evades them. Shanks crying when he reads Luffy's bounty for the first time. Those are later decisions reaching backward, grabbing older rubber fruit material and stitching new meaning into it. The early story did not behave as if this was the single most hunted mythical Zoan in history. Oda patched that in, very skillfully, when he needed to escalate. Category 3, pre-writing, the big one, the Void Century, the Will of D, Shanks as the red-haired herald of a new era. Those are the things Oda locked in before Chapter 1. Not the micro details, but the pillars. There will be a Joy Boy figure. There will be a baton pass between eras. There will be a red-haired man standing at the threshold between the old world and the new. Here's the thing. Oda's real superpower is not predicting every detail decades in advance. It is building a world so elastic it can absorb new ideas without snapping in half. Foreshadowing, retrofitting, pre-writing. He uses all 3, constantly. And the story holds because the frame is that strong. The categories are tools, not moral judgments. And Shanks is the perfect case study. Early Shanks is a chill mentor with a cool hat and a tragic arm. A symbol, not a spreadsheet. Oda keeps him vague on purpose. We do not know his crew's full strength, his territory, his politics. That vagueness is structural elasticity. As the themes of inherited will and the age of pirates versus the age of gods crystallize, Oda dials Shanks up from barroom role model to political gatekeeper who can walk into Marie-Joie and book a meeting with the Gorosei. Pattern interrupt. That is not a continuity error. That is a feature. By refusing to overdefine Shanks too early, Oda left himself room to escalate the stakes around him without breaking those early chapters. When the fruit becomes NIKA, when the government's panic gets retrofitted in, Shanks' mission can shift from guy who lost a rubber fruit to fallible handler of the world's most dangerous myth. And it still feels coherent. And no, this does not cheapen the story. This is fine. This is normal. It actually makes One Piece feel more alive, because you are watching an author grow, adjust, and re-aim his own pre-written endgame in real time. The Shanks/NIKA situation is not a plot hole. It is a masterclass in how to escalate your narrative from goofy East Blue adventure to cosmic liberation war without betraying the emotional truth of Chapter 1. Once you see that, you stop asking, did Oda plan this exact detail? And start asking a better question. How far can he push this elastic world before it finally hits its limit? And what happens to Shanks when it does? So here's the thing. Once you start asking, what happens to Shanks when the elastic finally snaps? You run into a much uglier answer than cool red-haired mentor bets on the new era. You run into a Shanks who wasn't there to light the fuse at all. He was there to smother it. I need you to sit with that for a second. Because in this model, Shanks' real mission is not to find Joy Boy. It's to keep Joy Boy from spawning too early. He's an unofficial custodian of the NIKA fruit, a regulator whose job is to keep that mythical Zoan out of circulation, or at least out of premature awakening. Not a recruiter, a dam. Where does that job come from? God Valley is the origin point. That's the trauma event. Young Shanks is literally found in a chest on Roger's ship right after the God Valley incident. The same historical black hole where rocks, celestial dragons, and a mysterious incident converge. You don't need a corkboard to see the category he gets filed into. Living evidence of a Joy Boy scale threat and whatever weapon or fruit was involved there. Then he spends years on Roger's crew, listening to the Pirate King and Rayleigh talk about Laugh-Tale, Joy Boy, the Void Century. That's not just vibes. That's training. That's the author intentionally giving him the one education in the world where NIKA isn't a bedtime story, it's a doomsday variable. When Roger dies, somebody has to inherit the don't let this go off at the wrong time mission. Shanks is the obvious candidate. Cut to the government ship. Who's Who tells us CP9 was guarding the Gomu Gomu no Mi, loses it to Shanks, and gets thrown in jail. The Gorosei later call it the HITO HITO no Mi model, NIKA, and complain that it always evades them. In other words, this fruit is a repeat offender. It slips out of their control again and again, and they treat it as a top priority asset. Shanks intercepting that ship isn't random piracy. It's him yanking the pin out of their grenade and pocketing it. So why Fuchsia? Because if your job is to sit on a god fruit, you don't park in Sabaody and wave at every admiral. You disappear into a no-name East Blue village where the most dangerous thing is a sea king and the mayor's blood pressure. Fuchsia is not a scouting trip for a chosen one. It's witness protection for a devil fruit. The fact that Luffy eats it is not destiny working as planned. It's the single biggest workplace accident in the series. From that moment, Shanks is in damage control mode. The arm sacrifice? Not a romantic bet on the future, a panicked decision to keep the newly bound NIKA vessel alive at any cost. Marineford? He's not just flexing to end a war, he's slamming the brakes on a global escalation that will force Luffy NIKA to awaken before the world is ready. The Gorosei meeting. That reads very differently if he's not tattling on some random pirate, but negotiating terms around the one fruit they both lost control of. And post-Wano, when he finally moves toward Luffy after Gear 5, that isn't, ah yes, my plan succeeded. That's the regulator approaching the reactor after the meltdown, trying to contain whatever's left. Could you read Shanks as a pure romantic who always believed in the new era? Sure. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal fan behavior. We are all pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast and bet on the next generation in every speech. But this custodian model fits better. It respects the textual beats. It makes political sense of the government's obsession, and it lines up with how this author actually does long-term writing. Pre-written endgame, very specific payoffs, minimal wasted motion. And if that's true, then the next question isn't, is Shanks good or evil? It's much worse. What happens when the world's failed gatekeeper finally has to choose between the boy he saved and the catastrophe he was raised to prevent? So when I say Shanks failed his mission, I need you to understand what that actually does to Luffy. It doesn't turn him into some passive chosen one whose name was written in the holy spreadsheet of destiny. It makes him the moron who wandered into the server room of reality, tripped over a cable, and accidentally hijacked root access. Under this model, the god fruit was never meant for him. This was a mythical zoan the government had on lockdown, guarded by CP9, tracked by the Gorosei, historically tied to Joy Boy and NIKA and all that cosmic baggage. Shanks is effectively the last human firewall between that fruit and the wrong user. And then this kid he's been drinking with for a year just chomps it. No ceremony, no prophecy, no "you are the one" speech. Just, dessert. Here's the thing, that actually makes Luffy stronger as a character, because suddenly his freedom isn't a reward for being the destined Joy Boy. It's him bending a pre-written myth around his own will. The NIKA legend says, warrior of liberation. The government says, existence is a crime. Shanks' whole life says, this power needs a responsible handler. Luffy hears all that and goes, cool story, I'm still going to be Pirate King. We need to put that in the same category as everything else he does to systems. He doesn't just inherit titles, he vandalizes them. Warlords. He turns them from a government enforcement category into a chaotic friend group. Yonko. He crashes Marineford, punches a celestial dragon, and forces the world to treat idiot from East Blue as a geopolitical term. Pirate King, Joy Boy, NIKA, those are supposed to be fixed narrative roles. Luffy treats them as hats he can wear while still being the guy who argues with his stomach. And this is not a sin. This is not bad writing. This is in fact how you make a protagonist feel intentional in a story that has giant cosmic foreshadowing baked in from chapter 1. The author pre-writes a god, a myth, a symbol, then hands it to the least qualified candidate and watches him refuse to be absorbed by it. So the tension of the final saga isn't just, can Luffy beat Imu? It's, can Luffy stay Luffy while everyone else insists he's NIKA? The Gorosei see a weapon that must be erased. Shanks sees the walking reminder that he blew the most important job of his life. The community inside the story, pirates, revolutionaries, kingdoms, start projecting their hopes and fears onto this one rubber idiot. How long before that pressure tries to rewrite him? Because thematically, this is the payoff. Freedom in One Piece is not a casting decision. It's not the universe handing you a script and you obediently reading your Joy Boy lines. It's seizing a power that was planned for something else and forcing the world to deal with your version instead. And the scary question the story hasn't answered yet is, what happens if the world decides it doesn't accept his version? So if freedom is Luffy hijacking a script that was written for someone else, we need to talk about the guy who was supposed to be holding the script. Because under this theory, Shanks isn't the cool uncle who bet on the new generation. He's the tragic stage manager who dropped God's prop. Here's the thing. Trace his timeline with the fruit, and it stops being a fun coincidence and starts reading as a multi-decade failure. Kid at God Valley. Apprentice under Roger when the crew uncovers Void's century truths. Then post-Roger, he somehow gets his hands on the exact mythical zone the government has been trying to erase from the board for centuries. Who's Who tells us CP9 was guarding it. The Gorosei call it the one that always slips away. That's not a gag. That's an asset you assign a custodian. And Shanks treats it that way. He doesn't eat it. He doesn't sell it. He docks in Fuchsia, keeps it on his ship, and hangs around a nowhere village for over a year. That's not a pirate on vacation. That's a guy babysitting a warhead and waiting for the next intentional handoff. Then a random kid eats it in a tavern. Mission failed in the dumbest, most human way possible. Listen to me. Once you read him as the man who blew the Godfruit escort quest, his entire vibe across the story shifts. The calm, the restraint, the I will end this war with one walk-on panel and then leave. That's not mysterious cool guy energy. That's someone who cannot afford escalation because escalation means Joy Boy waking up wrong. He stops Kaido from going to Marineford, he shuts down Akainu, He negotiates directly with the Gorosei. Every appearance is crisis management from the guy who already dropped the ball once. And that sets up the confrontation everyone keeps mislabeling as a mental reunion. I need you to stop picturing Shanks handing Luffy a gold star and a beer. If this theory is right, that meeting is a trial. Shanks has to answer a binary question. Is this Joy Boy the liberator the world needed, or did my failure create a threat that has to be stopped? Not coached, stopped. Pattern interrupt. What if Shanks is the final exam, not the recommendation letter? So you get these potential beats Oda has been quietly foreshadowing. Shanks forcing Luffy into a real clash, not a friendly spar, to test the resolve behind Gear 5's cartoon chaos. Shanks finally explaining what happened at God Valley, why the fruit was on that CP ship, why the government panicked when it awakened. Maybe he even offers his life as proof, staking his death on the belief that this version of Joy Boy is safe to unleash. That turns his arc into an actual arc. From chosen custodian of a god fruit, to the idiot who lost it to a kid in a bar, to the final arbiter of the new era standing between the old plan and Luffy's remix. He stops being a piece of merchandise with red hair and becomes a character whose entire existence is an argument about destiny, failure, and who gets to sign off on freedom. And the uncomfortable part is, what if Luffy has to win that argument by force? So here's where this stops being Shanks' character study and turns into a tool you can actually use. Because if you walk away from this video going, wow, Oda is a genius, everything was planned from day one, you have learned nothing and I have failed you. I need you to take this Shanks NIKA mess and start pointing it at other headaches in this story. Emu, the giant straw hat in the freezer, the Void Century, Blackbeard's very illegal body. Every time you touch one of those, you should be asking, is this pre-writing? Is this foreshadowing? Or is this a retrofit that Oda dressed up in a nice coat? Here's the thing, you already do this. You just don't have names for it. When you see Will of D, your brain goes, ooh, big symbol, mysterious clan, inherited will. That's pre-writing territory. Oda clearly decided very early. There is a letter. It means something. It connects to the Void Century and the Endgame. But the exact origin, the first person who used it, the full sentence the D stands for, that is still in his pocket. It's planned in concept, not in detail. Contrast that with the NIKA fruit. For 20 years, the story tells you it's rubber. The jokes are rubber. The fights are rubber. The community treats Luffy as the simple fruit user. Then we hit 1-0 and suddenly it's Hito Hito, model, NIKA, sun god, drum of liberation. That is a retrofit built on a mountain of existing material, the goofy art style, the cartoon physics, decades of this kid bends reality gags. It's a really good retrofit, but the category is different from Will of D. So how do you tell which is which when you're theory crafting? Use a stupid little checklist. First question, did the author need this detail in year 1? Did Oda need Imu's silhouette to start Romance Dawn? No. Did he need the idea that there was a lost century and an inherited will that terrifies the government? Yes, because that's the spine of the whole story's politics. Second question, is there evidence he knew it then? Interviews, SBS, old drafts, weird consistency. If you can't find any trail, this is not a sin. This is normal. It just means you tag it as probably retrofit instead of 20-year mastermind plan. Third question, does the emotional core work without the later reveal? Shanks losing his arm to save a rubber kid works before NIKA. Robin's backstory works before we know every detail of Ohara. If the scene still hits, the foreshadowing is probably real. If the scene only matters after a twist, you might be looking at a retrofit. And listen to me, we need to stop declaring every parallel foreshadowing because it feels good. You are a pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. I am too. This is fine. Use the framework to keep yourself honest. So when you do find a real, intentional setup, it actually means something. Because once you start reading One Piece this way, you're not just guessing answers anymore. You're watching a long game of craft unfold in slow motion. And to really see that, we have to talk about the one mystery Oda has been openly bragging about since day one, the ending itself. And this is where some of you are already in the comments going, who cares? Foreshadowing, retrofitting, pre-writing. If it's cool, it's cool. I hear you. I get that instinct. But listen to me. The labels change how you talk about the story, and they absolutely change what you learn from it. If you treat every payoff as perfect foreshadowing, you turn Oda into a prophecy machine instead of an author. The problem isn't praising him. The problem is you stop seeing the work. You stop seeing the drafts that didn't make it, the wrong turns, that fruit I made up in chapter 1 needs to carry the entire Joy Boy mythology now. Panic. You turn craft into myth, and once you do that, you can't grow from it as a writer or as a community. Here's the thing. When we say this was planned about everything, we erase the courage it takes to change your mind. Recognizing a retrofit is not an insult. It's a compliment with X-ray vision. When Oda takes the goofy rubber fruit gag and, decades later, welds on the HITO HITO no Mi model NIKA. That's not a smoking gun of god-tier foresight. That's a veteran author refusing to be handcuffed by his 20-something self. And that decision is hard. Most of you, if you wrote Gomu Gomu no Mi on page 1, would feel trapped by it forever. Oda looks at that same decision and goes, no, actually, this is the perfect chassis for a sun god. That's retrofitting done with intention. That's not a sin. This is normal. This is how long-running storytelling survives its own origin mistakes. Pattern interrupt. Think about Who's Who for a second. That entire subplot exists to explain why losing this dumb rubber fruit got a CP9 agent thrown in jail. That's not proof Oda knew it was NIKA in 1997. That's proof he was willing to go back, bolt on new context, and then carry the weight of that choice forward through the Gorosei, CP0, and Shanks hearing about some rookie in East Blue. When you acknowledge that, you also protect yourself. Because if you assume everything is perfectly planned, then any wobble is betrayal. Any inconsistency becomes Oda fell off, instead of Oda is juggling a 25-year plate stack and occasionally has to glue a new plate on. We need to be able to say, this part was pre-written, this part was foreshadowing, this part is a retrofit, so our expectations stay human instead of divine. And that brings us back to Shanks. If you insist he's a flawless mastermind who orchestrated Luffy's destiny from God Valley onward, you flatten him. You turn him into a lore spreadsheet. But if you see him as a character who grew because the story, and Oda, had to adapt around a massive fruit-shaped mistake, he gets more interesting. He's a guy who stole a world-class asset, lost it to a kid, and then had to decide what to do with the era that failure created. I need you to hold that version of Shanks in your head, because once you do, his so-called mission looks very different when we walk through the actual timeline. So let's zoom out, because at this point we've thrown a lot of God Valley dust and Gorosei cigars at your face. The core claim is actually very simple. Luffy was never supposed to eat that fruit. Shanks' real mission was to keep the NIKA fruit contained, and the moment he failed in Fuchsia, the entire trajectory of the world quietly snapped in half. Here's the thing. To even see that, we needed the framework. We separated the chaos into 3 categories. Early Shanks. That's pre-writing. Oda knows this red-haired kid is Roger's heir. God Valley fallout in human form. Future Emperor. Future Gatekeeper. The NIKA retcon on top of Gomu Gomu no Mi. That's retrofitting. Taking a goofy rubber gimmick and assigning it divine Joy Boy level significance later. And then you've got the genuine foreshadowing sprinkled on top. The sun motifs. Who's Who's story about the special fruit. The Gorosei whispering about a power that always slips through their fingers. Run the timeline with that lens, and it stops feeling random. God Valley happens. Rocks falls, Roger and Garp win. A celestial dragon incident is erased, and a baby Shanks ends up in Roger's hands. That's ground zero. Decades later, Shanks is on his own crew, and we learn from Who's Who that he hits a government ship guarded by CP9 to steal one specific fruit, not a random devil fruit haul. A top priority asset someone goes to prison for losing. Then he sails into Fuchsia, sits there for over a year with that exact fruit on ice, and just happens to let the pattern-seeking monkey child who screams about pirates wander around his storage room. Listen to me. In that chain, the Fuchsia accident is the failure state. The mission was containment. The mission was, don't let this awaken again. Instead, a rubber-brained kid hijacks destiny by taking a bite. From then on, every Shanks move reads as damage control. Protecting Luffy from the Sea King, staking his arm and his reputation at Marineford to stop a Kainu, marching into the Holy City to meet the Gorosei, not as some random emperor, but as the guy who knows exactly which mythical Zoan they lost. And finally, in Wano, the fruit awakens, Gear 5 erupts, and the world the government has been trying to prevent since God Valley finally arrives. That reframes both leads. Luffy isn't a neat, chosen one whose crown was waiting on a shelf. He's a hijacker of a weapon, an unplanned joy boy forcing the story to adapt. Shanks isn't a flawless mentor sprinkled with red-haired wisdom. He's a gatekeeper carrying an inherited sin, improvising around the one job he failed. And this is not a sin in the writing. This is fine. This is normal. Seeing the seams between pre-writing, retrofits, and real foreshadowing doesn't make One Piece weaker. It makes Oda more human and more terrifyingly competent. Because once you accept that Luffy was never meant to eat that fruit, we need to ask one last, very uncomfortable question. Who was it actually meant for? So before we crown this as the one true Shanks gospel, we need to pump the brakes. A lot of what I've just walked you through, it's a model. It's a way of arranging puzzle pieces, not a leaked storyboard from Oda's desk. Shanks' exact deal with the government, who the fruit was reserved for, what was in Oda's head in 1997 when he drew a goofy rubber kid in a barrel, we do not know that. Anyone telling you they do is selling something. Here's the thing. Long-form analysis of an ongoing series is inherently provisional. It has to be. Tomorrow, Oda can drop a chapter where the Gorosei say, yeah, actually, we misidentified that fruit. Our bad. And suddenly half this video moves from strong theory to historical curiosity. This is not a sin. This is fine. This is normal. When you're dealing with a 25-year serialized story, you're building scaffolding on a building that's still under construction. So I need you to treat this less as scripture and more as a tool. I'm not handing you an answer sheet for the Joy Boy exam. I'm trying to give you a framework for thinking about foreshadowing, for separating this was clearly planned from this is a very enthusiastic pattern-seeking monkey who sees Jesus in toast. Who's Who going to prison over the stolen fruit? CP0 panicking the second Gear 5 pops. The Gorosei admitting the NIKA fruit slips through their fingers. Those are hard data points. Shanks was contracted to deliver it to X specific person. That's a hypothesis. And listen to me, that distinction matters. Because the problem in this community is not that fans theorize. The problem is when every headcanon gets framed as inevitable destiny. We need to leave room for alternative models that still respect the same constraints. Industry reality, textual evidence, and the difference between genuine foreshadowing and retrofitting. You want to argue Shanks stole the fruit for Roger's unborn heir instead of a government weapon program? Cool. Show me how it fits the timeline, the interviews, the panels. Put it in the same category of disciplined storytelling, not wish fulfillment. Pattern interrupt. It is completely possible that Oda did not have HITO HITO no Mi, model NIKA, written on a sticky note in 1997. That does not make the current execution worse. It just changes which parts are pre-writing, which parts are retrofit, and which parts are him being a terrifyingly efficient gardener pruning his own story. The uncertainty is the fun. We're not dissecting a corpse. We're tracking a living animal through the forest and arguing over footprints. Every new Shanks appearance, meeting the Gorosei, reacting to Luffy's bounty, hovering at the edge of big events, either tightens this model or breaks it in interesting ways. And when he finally spells out his real mission on panel, I fully expect some of this to age beautifully and some of it to age worse than early 2000s fan AMVs. That's the deal. That's the game. That's the deal. That's the game. But if you're going to play this game in public, on the internet, with other pattern-seeking monkeys who see Jesus in toast every time Shanks breathes on a panel, we need to talk about self-defense. I need you to have ground rules. Not for them. For you. Rule 1. Define your terms. When you say foreshadowing, do you mean Oda intentionally planned this payoff in advance? Or do you mean this older panel now fits the new reveal in a satisfying way? That first one is foreshadowing. The second is retrofitting. Both are valid forms of storytelling. This is not a sin. This is normal. The problem is when you argue about category without saying which category you're in. So in practice you say, here's my claim. Here's the panel. Here's whether I think it's planned or retrofit. And then you add the most adult sentence in fandom discourse. Personally, I prefer this reading. That's you drawing a bright neon line between the text says this and I like this better. You can be wrong about intent. You cannot be wrong about preference. That distinction will save you from losing your mind over some teenager on Twitter with a Zoro PFP. Second tool, and I want this stapled to your brain. Before you scream, Oda planned this from chapter 1, ask, is this something the author needed to know in year 1? Not, could he have? Needed. Did he need Luffy's exact mythical zone model to write Romance Dawn? Probably not. Did he need Rubber Boy with a secret Freedom God adjacent fruit that the government lost once and is terrified of losing again? Much more plausible. That question forces you to think in terms of writing process, not mythology. Third, use the Shanks/NIKA situation as your template. You walk through timeline, author context, then in-world logic in that order, So, God Valley era, Roger era, Shanks stealing the fruit from a government ship, Fuchsia village, the Gorosei finally dropping the NIKA name. You ask, when did Oda confirm the real fruit name in interviews? When did he start drawing sun motifs? When did the government's panic first show up? Then, and only then, do you go, okay, destiny or failure, gatekeeper or babysitter who dropped the baby? Here's the thing, you have to stop treating Oda as an infallible 4D chess engine. He is an absurdly disciplined planner. He is also a human who can change his mind, follow a cool new idea, or just miscount someone's bounty once. This is fine. This is normal. Allowing for that makes the actual intentional foreshadowing stand out sharper, because you're not forcing every coincidence into the God-tier mastermind frame. And this is your in-group invitation. You are not in the Oda is omniscient, everything is planned, shut up cult. You are in the community that respects craft. You ask about drafts and timelines. You separate categories. You can still go feral over Gear 5, but you can also say, here's where the writing shows its seams, and here's where the pre-writing flexes. That stance is cooler. It makes you harder to gaslight by memes, and it sets you up for the next step. Actually testing this framework on other so-called destiny plots in One Piece. So here's where you stop being a content sponge and start being dangerous. We've spent this whole time building a framework. Now, I need you to swing it at the Shanks myth yourself. In the comments, drop your version of Shanks' real mission, but with one rule: label every single piece. If you think Shanks stealing the fruit from that CP9 ship was always about NIKA, tag it as foreshadowing. If you think Oda saw Who's Who in the draft stage and went, "Oh, perfect, I can backfill Shanks' heist here," that's retrofitting. If you think the entire God Valley to Roger to Shanks to Gorosei pipeline was planned in a notebook before Chapter 1, that's pre-writing. State your model. State your category. Don't just say Oda cooked. Tell me which stove he used. Here's the thing. Once you do it once, you can't stop. So I need you to pick one other one-piece mystery and run the exact same stress test. Take Blackbeard's body and his never sleeps weirdness. Take Imu silently sitting on the empty throne. Take the will of D and all those grinning corpses. Go through panel history, interview scraps, SBS chaos, and saw every hint into foreshadowing, retrofitting, or pre-writing. Then come back and report your findings. Turn this comment section into a lab report, not a shrine to your favorite headcanon. Because if you do that, you stop being passive fans and you become co-analysts. You're not just pattern-seeking monkeys seeing Jesus in toast every time a silhouette appears. You're actually interrogating what the author intentionally set up versus what we're emotionally stapling together after the fact. This is not a sin. This is not anti-fun. This is, in fact, how you get more fun out of the writing. Also, weaponize this video. Share it with that one friend who insists Oda planned everything from Chapter 1, as if he emerged from the womb holding the final script. Send it to them with a friendly, "Cool, categorize this," and see which parts of their favorite examples survive once we separate foreshadowing from retrofit. This is fine. This is normal. Iron sharpens iron. Nerd sharpens nerd. And if you're into this framework, we need to keep going. I'm already sketching follow-ups where we run the same lens on Blackbeard's three-skull Jolly Roger and body horror, on Imu's impossible authority, on the will of D as a pre-written inheritance plot versus a late thematic retrofit. If you want those deep dives, tell me which one to dissect first and drop the receipts you want on the operating table. Because listen to me, we just spent roughly 2 hours untangling one devil fruit and one red-haired pirate. One fruit. One guy who won't even stay on screen for 10 chapters. And if that doesn't prove that we have completely lost the plot, in the best, most obsessive, most community-brained way possible, nothing will. So subscribe, hit the thing, grab your notes, and I'll see you in the next autopsy.